Chapter 295. Jing Jiu led Lu Shui out of the cell, heading toward the outside of the sword jail. But it wasn't the way they had come here. As they came to the end of the passage, the stone gate opened slowly. Jing Jiu shot a glance at Lu Shui, thinking that he had no idea what he had missed. He had told Lu Shui that he should think about it when the time came. It would be a waste to think about it in advance. Jing Jiu had already thought everything through when he learned that the meeting of Aoyama would be held. Jing Jiu watched Lu Shui enter the sword jail, hoping that he could meet the dead dog. The energies in Lu Shui's body were too complicated, and they conflicted with each other, making it very dangerous. The dead dog could transform the filthiest and most complicated energy of the demons into the purest Taoist energy. Besides the old dragon of the Zhongzhou school, the dead dog was the only one who could do it. It was a pity that Lu Shui didn't have such an opportunity, so he had no choice but to go to the Guochang Temple. After leaving the sword jail, they arrived in the midst of the peaks. The ocean of clouds was like a carpet, and the starlight was like the snow. The peak stood quietly in the midst of the ocean of clouds. It was a beautiful scene. Looking at the scene in front of him, Lu Shui asked, "Where are we?" He had flown many times in Aoyama after he had learned how to ride the sword, and had seen all the sceneries of the peaks, but he had never seen anything like this. "This is the Hermit Peaks," said Jing Jiu. In the early morning the next day, lying in the spacious carriage and looking at the clouds drifting away through the transparent glass on the roof of the carriage, Lu Shui recalled what he had experienced last night, feeling a bit shocked. It turned out that one had to go through the sword jail to enter the Hermit Peaks. Did it mean that the Hermit Peaks were the larger sword jail? Xiaohe pulled back her line of sight from the decorations in the carriage and said with a hint of admiration, "It's only a carriage, but it's so extravagant. I wonder how much money the Gu clan has made over the years." The Aoyama sect is indeed the #1 sect in the world. Even a random clan can have such a reputation. Lu Shui replied casually, "Our Aoyama sect is of course something. I heard that young master asked us to keep this carriage." Xiaohe made a sound of agreement and leaned against his side. She felt that this kind of life was really very happy. Lu Shui said, "Before this matter is over, I can't walk around as a disciple of Aoyama. There's not much use for you to follow me." He had always known why he was willing to follow him. Xiaohe hugged his arm tightly and said with a sweet smile, "You are the most useful person. Otherwise, why would I insist on waiting for you to come out?" She now roughly understood what Gu Qing meant by true. Lu Shui smiled and said nothing. The farther they were from Cloudy Town, the lighter the clouds outside the skylight became. Gradually, they could see the withered branches of the autumn trees and the gray sky. All kinds of scenery kept changing before his eyes. He thought about how this car had been parked in Cloudy Town for years, just waiting for Jing Jiu to take a ride. Xiaohe said sentimentally, "I really didn't know that immortal master Jing Jiu likes to enjoy life so much." Lu Shui said, "As I said, he's very lazy and doesn't like to ride on a sword. So, of course, walking is not as comfortable as riding a carriage. A place that could be reached in one day by riding a sword or using the escape method would usually take dozens of days by riding a carriage. For a cultivation practitioner, this was something unbearable. Therefore, no matter how comfortable the carriage of the Gu clan was, Lu Shui and Xiao, he couldn't stand it for the last few days. One early morning, seeing the crops in the farmland by the road, Lu Shui was surprised that the rice was growing so well. Looking carefully, he found that the farmland was full of fertile black soil. Only then did he realize that they had arrived at Machio. After the carriage traveled for a few more hours, he finally saw the yellow walls and clean tiles in the distance. He breathed a sigh of relief. Because of the letter, the reception monk of the Guochang Temple didn't stop them. He took the carriage directly into the depths of the temple with great courtesy. Then he said to Lu Shui, "The Zen master has been practicing in seclusion all year round and rarely sees visitors. So, we can only wait and see what he will say after the letter is delivered." In a quiet meditation room in the depths of the temple, The Zen master looked at the pile of thin sticks on the table in silence. His expression was extremely serious and focused. He didn't move for a long time, not even blinking his eyes. He just rubbed his bare feet from time to time under his monk robe, looking very cute. Taking the letter from the reception monk, Shunlian was a little surprised when he saw the signature on it. He opened the envelope and saw the signature on the paper. He was silent for a long time, thinking, "Zhao Liu, we don't have any friendship, so why did you write this letter?" After reading the contents of the letter, he shook his head repeatedly, feeling that it was ridiculous. "If I help you settle this matter, I will be even with the Shinma Peak. What kind of attitude is this? Do I owe the Shinma Peak anything? It seems that I owed you some favors before, but I've already paid them off." Zen Master's line of sight continued, moving down to the second, last paragraph of the letter. In the cultivation tournament of the plum meeting that year, Zen Master's decisiveness saved many people, but we have told you in advance that this matter is still. You are too slow. This was what Zhao Liu had written. Reading this paragraph, the expression on Zen Master's face faded, and he fell silent for a long time. Yes, he was too slow. If he had ordered the cultivation tournament of the plum meeting to stop immediately after learning about the conjecture of the Aoyama sect, instead of thinking about it that night, many young disciples would still be alive. Over the years, he had reflected on this matter the most. It does sound like an old acquaintance. Invite that young friend to come in. Zen Master raised his eyebrows and said to the reception monk. Lu Shui walked into the meditation room, and Xiao he stayed in the carriage. Not all the vixens were as lucky as royal concubine who in the royal palace. Zen Master had a high and honorable status in the cultivation world, and even in the human world. It was a great fortune to meet him. Only a certain person of the Shinma Peak would treat him so casually and understand him so well. Zen Master had remarked earlier that Zhao Liu had the demeanor of an old acquaintance, but he didn't know that this letter was written by an old acquaintance and written by Zhao Liu. Lu Shui didn't know the story between Jing Jiao and Zen Master, so he felt a bit nervous. He had met the sect master of Aoyama and was familiar with the important figures like Shi Wang's son, but Zen Master was different. Zen Master took a look at him and compared it with the content of the letter and found out where the problem was. He raised his eyebrows slightly, thinking that it was indeed troublesome. He reached out his hand and grabbed hundreds of golden amulets from the empty air and then imprinted them on the silk cloth he had prepared earlier. Lu Shui took the silk cloth, still in a state of shock. "You have done a great service to the Orthodox sects in the matter of Bulo Lin, so it's only right that I help you." Zen Master looked at him and said with a serious expression, "But how much you can learn depends on your own comprehension." Lu Shui looked at the silk cloth and found that the first 4 words were, "As I have heard." He was even more surprised, thinking that this was the true script of the Zen sects of the Guocheng Temple that was not taught to outsiders. He knew that Senior Grandmaster Jingyang and Zen Master were half teacher and half friend, but this generous gift. What kind of person was the young master? He forced himself to calm down, thanked Zen Master sincerely, and was ready to leave. Just as he was about to step over the threshold of the meditation room, he suddenly stopped and looked back at Zen Master, saying somewhat embarrassedly, "It's not convenient for me, till I know you can't let others know, so I'll make them shut up." Zen Master said expressionlessly, "What Guocheng Temple is best at is silent meditation." Lu Shui left the meditation room. Zen Master's gaze fell on the letter again, and this time he read the last paragraph. Why does a swordsman of Aoyama want to learn silent meditation? He thought that this request to Zhao Liu was really absurd, so he didn't pay attention to it. Lu Shui's figure gradually disappeared over the pagoda forest, and a carriage could be vaguely seen. Zen Master looked in that direction and shook his head, thinking that the qi in this little fellow's body was really too chaotic. It would be very difficult to completely dispel it with just the Buddhist Dharma. If one were to send a Buddha to the West, one had to strive for complete success. Perhaps he would even need to send a letter to Yamatsai. Then he looked at the letter again. This letter was very simple. Chapter 296. The Guecheng Temple must have been instructed by Zen master to arrange the follow-up affairs in a very appropriate and secretive manner. The receptionist monk who had met Lu Shui and Xiao, he left Machio joyfully and went to Jui City to work as a doctor monk to support the colleagues of the Windy Broadsword cult. Other than Zen master, no one else in the Guecheng Temple knew the identity of Lu Shui and Xiao He. Even the supervising monk who specifically arranged for them only thought that they were lay relatives of the leader of the rear hall. Lu Shui was not assigned the identity of a lay disciple, because that would be too conspicuous. What about Xiao He? It just so happened that the couple who had been growing vegetables in the front yard of the Guecheng Temple for 30 years were taken to live a comfortable life by their son, who had passed the school entrance examination in the county town. So the vegetable garden was empty, and he and Xiao He could take over. It was a very simple environment. Fortunately, there was a well, so they didn't need to fetch water. The kitchen was also very clean, so Xiao He was quite satisfied. Looking at the green everywhere, Lu Shui thought that the Guecheng Temple was indeed blessed by the Dharma. There were so many green vegetables in the late autumn. It was not difficult for him to return to the farming life in the mountain village again. What worried him was that the sutra given to him by Zen Master was really abstruse and difficult to understand. But Zen Master had made it clear that he could only understand the sutra by himself. Of course, even if he wanted to find someone to ask, who could he ask? Someone came early the next morning. It was a handsome young man with a clean smile. The first time Lu Shui saw the young man, he felt that he was very close to him. For some reason, the young man was stunned when he saw him. Looking at the big basket the young man brought, Lu Shui guessed that he was a servant from the Guecheng Temple who came to pick up vegetables. "What's wrong?" he asked. The young man came back to his senses and said with a smile, "I just saw Uncle Gong suddenly become a young man like you. I thought he had eaten some magic elixir." Lu Shui also laughed and helped him pick the vegetables from the field into the basket. "What's your name?" he asked. The young man said with a smile, "My name is Fu." The days passed just like that. Apart from tending to the vegetable fields, Lu Shui spent his days comprehending the scripture, but his progress was extremely slow. Silent, Xiao He sat in front of the window and embroidered all kinds of things. At this speed, by the time Lu Shui learned the scripture, she might have already embroidered her granddaughter's wedding dress. The young man named Fu would come to the vegetable garden every day to collect vegetables, and soon became familiar with Lu Shui. One day, a state duke came from Zhaoga City. It was said that he wanted to fulfill the vow on behalf of the emperor. The Guecheng Temple had a very close relationship with the Jing royal family, so this kind of thing happened frequently. Every year, a few dukes would come to the temple. The monks in the temple were already used to it and did not pay much attention to it. However, the accompanying nobles and officials naturally wanted to taste the famous vegetarian dishes of the Guecheng Temple, so they naturally ate a lot more dishes. Looking at the baskets full of vegetables, Lu Shui helped Fu put the vegetables in. This was the first time he came to the back kitchen of the Guecheng Temple. It was steaming hot in the back kitchen. An old man stood in front of the stove with his upper body bare, waving the spatula forcefully. The old man had sparse hair, so it was hard to tell if he was a cook or a cook in the temple. The old man picked up a white towel to wipe his face from time to time. It was unclear whether it was because he had wiped too much or because it was too hot, but the tip of his nose was a bit red. Hearing the voice behind him, the old man said without turning his head, "The vegetables are in the same place." Fu said, "You'd better take a look yourself in case you say I made a mistake again." The old man was obviously surprised. As he turned around and saw Lu Shui, he screamed with wide eyes. "What's wrong?" asked Lu Shui in surprise. Fu tilted his head and looked at the old man, saying nothing with a smile. The old man said quickly, "It's nothing. The vegetable oil is too muddy today, so it's easy to explode. I was scalded." It was nightfall, in a room in the back hall of the Guecheng Temple. The old man with the red nose stared at the young man and said, "So you're here for him, immortal?" The young man said innocently, "I swear in the name of the founding masters of Aoyama, this is absolutely a coincidence." He was not In Fu, but In San. The old man with the red nose was also not the cook of the Guocheng Temple, but the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect was annoyed. Then why do you insist on coming here? In San sighed. I've sinned a lot in my life, and I want to seek salvation through the Dharma. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect spat. I don't know which of your words are true and which are false, but this one is definitely false. What if it's true? In San asked with a smile. It's fine if it's somewhere else, but this is the Guocheng Temple, where the chief monk has a profound understanding of the Dharma and is no weaker than me. Not to mention that there's also the Zen master, whose abilities are unknown. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect said earnestly, what if we're discovered? I can run, but how can you? The smile on In San's face grew wider as he said, if I can't run, you'll be in big trouble. That's why I'm worried, the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect said with a bitter smile. In San didn't pursue this topic. He walked to the window and looked at the night sky, saying, I've told you before that I like this kid, Lu Shui. It was written clearly in front of the temple in White Town. He prayed to the Buddha, the Taoism, and himself. Regardless of whether he prayed to the Buddha or the Taoism, he always prayed to himself. Perhaps the one he prayed to was Lu Shui. Otherwise, why would they meet in the Buddhist temple? While thinking of these questions, he clasped his hands behind his back and stroked the bone flute. The bone flute had become smoother, but the thin red line on it had become clearer. Watching from behind, the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect thought with narrowed eyes. Is this bone flute used to isolate the great formation of Aoyama and connect it with the spiritual soul? If the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect snatched the bone flute or destroyed it, what would happen then? What are you thinking about? In San suddenly turned to look at him. The expression on the face of the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect didn't change, and his eyes were still narrowed as he said, You've always said that it was your Aoyama, and Jian Russian was also your junior. Why did you kill him? In San smiled and said, The number of Aoyama disciples that have died in my hands is much more than the number you've killed. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect praised, You have killed more enemies of Aoyama. In San waved his hand and said, The first child sword and Su Zai's corpse were not found. What do you think? The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect's expression remained unchanged, but he was inwardly horrified. In San's current realm was still very low, so there were many things that he needed to rely on. How did In San know about such secretive information when even he didn't know about it? Could it be that Jing Jiao had already made contact with the remaining members of the Old Ones, the elite swordsmen, without being aware of it himself? Thinking of these things, he replied very seriously, I don't know anything. The monks were vegetarians, so there were many vegetable gardens around the temples. It was the case in the Guocheng Temple, and it was the case in the distant Baodong Zen Temple in the southwest. All the loofahs in the vegetable garden had been picked up, except for a few which were left to be used for washing dishes after they were ripe. The summer was over, and the purple eggplants were all gone, except for some green eggplants. Su Zai's face had turned back from purple to green. The poison had been completely removed. Lying on the headboard, he felt bored as he watched Hejan and Tong Yin bicker, wondering how the disciples of the Orthodox sect had oppressed his own sect to such a state back then if they were all like this. I really don't know what Tong Lu will do. Tong Yin said this while looking at the chessboard while sitting by the window. Chapter 297. Tong Yin said without turning her head around, It would be difficult for anybody to kill their own master. He would feel embarrassed and uneasy, and this kind of emotion is quite good. It will make Jian Shilai believe that he is the pitiful person who has finally given up the meaningless illusions and returned to the sect after experiencing too many hardships in the world. Like Lu Shui, he is quite sincere and doesn't conceal his true feelings. As such, he is the most suitable person to be a mole. Otherwise, your aunt wouldn't have sent him to us. Hejan asked, What if Tong Lu regrets his decision? Tong Yin put down the chess piece in her hand and said after a moment of silence, People like us will usually regret it after we finish what we have done. Reneging and regretting were two different words. That's right, just like what happened to Lo Huainan. Having said this in a mocking tone, Su Zai's face suddenly turned pale. He took out something from the case hastily and held it in his hand. His body started trembling, and the trembling grew more and more violent. His face started twisting, as if he was suffering a great deal of pain. Yet his eyes were full of delight, and yet an extreme coldness could be seen in the deep end of his eyes. The case was given to Su Zai by Guodong. Hejan thought it was the antidote. He didn't pay much attention to it, even though he had seen it a few times. It wasn't until today that he suddenly felt something was out of place. He walked over curiously to see what was in the case. "Don't touch it," Tong Yin warned him. "It's the pill poison inside." The expression on Hejan's face changed abruptly, and he pulled back his hand hastily. There was a kind of devil crane living on the islands in the south. They had a red crown on their heads, and the crown contained a strong poison. If they were not poisoned to death, their spiritual souls that were damaged by the poison would become extremely stable and able to resist more pain. But if the pill poison gradually dissipated, the resistance would become a great pain. As far as the orthodox cultivation practitioners were concerned, the pill poison was not beneficial to their cultivation, so nobody tried it. Yet, as for the deviant practitioners, the lack of spiritual sources forced them to find other ways, like the blood sacrifice or planting the demonic embryos. These cultivation methods were quite problematic, and they could cause a great deal of pain to the cultivation practitioners, which could make them lose their minds. The so-called killing of the innocent was the result of all kinds of evil deeds. If they wanted to keep themselves awake, pill toxins were often their last resort. Evil cultivators often had unimaginably strong willpower, but they still couldn't resist the temptation of pill toxins and the pain afterwards. Once they were infected, they couldn't get rid of it. They needed to take more and more pill toxins, and the toxins in their bodies would accumulate. Their bodies would grow weaker and weaker until they finally died. There were even people who had once calculated that the number of evil cultivators who had died hundreds of years ago from pill poisons was probably more than the number of evil cultivators who had died under the swords of the righteous sections. In the last few hundred years, as the corrupt path had declined, not many corrupt cultivators have been willing to pay such a painful price to sober up and advance. As a result, such matters have become much rarer. In the last 100 years, there had been even less news of pill poisons. Hejan had never personally seen one until today. "Are you crazy?" As Su Zai gradually returned to normal, Hejan yelled angrily while staring at him. "You'll die." Looking at him in silence, Su Zai asked, "I'm a deviant practitioner. How can I be your friend?" Hejan didn't know what to say. The reason he could befriend Su Zai was that he had some good qualities and he didn't have too much blood on his hands. As the young master of the deviant sects, Su Zai didn't kill the innocent people and did bloody things. It was because he was calm enough. As a natural demonic embryo, he could remain so calm even though he had to endure endless pain every day. It was because he had the help of pill poisons. "It's important for me to stay sober. It's because I don't want to live like my father," Su Zai went on calmly. "But more importantly, I want to become stronger. I have to pursue something after coming to this world." Hejan said sadly while looking at him, "But it'll be very painful, and you'll die early." Su Zai asked with a faint smile, "Do you have any way to solve my problem then?" This problem couldn't be solved. Otherwise, there would be no distinction between the orthodox and deviant sects in the cultivation world. The spiritual sources in Chaotian were limited, and most of them were owned by the orthodox sects or occupied by them. Tong Yin suddenly said, "You should reconsider my suggestion last time." Su Zai let out a devious smile, thinking that even if she were willing to share the spiritual sources of the orthodox sects, like the Kunlun sect, with her own strength, how could she achieve it? Note, the stone beam between Shuriwa Peak and Shilai Peak was still hidden in the devilish clouds and fog. Fang Jingtian landed on the beam, looking like a ferryman with his silvery eyebrows fluttering. The clouds and fog stirred slightly, and the dark figure in the deep end became much clearer. It was none other than the Dark Phoenix, the principal guardian of Aoyama. Fong Jingtian said, "My two big brothers couldn't overcome the life-or-death situation, so they should understand my master's painstaking effort back then. I don't believe they don't regret it." The Dark Phoenix said, "It's meaningless to talk about this, unless you can take Yuan Qijing and kneel before the memorial tablet of the Grandmasters and swear an oath." Fong Jingtian said, "It's not important. I think you should believe that he is not Jingyan by now." "I don't know what you mean by should," said the Dark Phoenix. Fong Jingtian said, "He had lived on Shangda Peak for so many years. Even though his cultivation state is low now, it's impossible that he can't be imprisoned in the sword jail." The Dark Phoenix said with a sneer, "Those two kids are merely a camouflage. You've been fooled." Fong Jingtian said icily, "In order to save Lu Shui, is it really something Jingyang would do at the risk of his identity being discovered?" The Dark Phoenix said with a sneer, "Has he ever thought of concealing himself since the first day he entered Aoyama? Don't you think it's suspicious?" Fong Jingtian retorted, "From the South Pine Pavilion to the Sword Washing Stream, from the Sword Peak to the Shima Peak, from Lu Shui to Zhao Leu, from the inherited sword to the sword testing, Jing Jiu was always the center of attention, no matter how lazy he was and how unsociable he was. He was like a bright sun in the sky, so bright that it was impossible for him not to be noticed. If he was indeed someone who had returned to Aoyama with a secret, why would he do so?" Lying on the bamboo chair, Jingju looked at the ocean of clouds outside the cliff, not moving his line of sight for a long time. The ceramic plate was in his hand, and the sand grains were between his fingers. It was evident that he was not in the mood to play games at the moment. He was thinking about something, and it was the rare kind that could be seen through. He was thinking very seriously. "So we'll just let it go?" Zhao Leu walked to his side and said. She had been preparing for cultivation since she was a little girl, so she seldom socialized with others. It was even more so after she came to Aoyama. She had only gone out with Jingjiu twice. She was still a young girl, even though she was no longer a young girl. In fact, this kind of situation was quite common in the cultivation circle, like the young girls of Qingrong Peak or the young disciples of other sections. The cultivation practitioners had a long lifespan. Anyone who was less than 50 years old could be called a young disciple. It was inevitable that a young girl would have a temper, even though she was an important figure now. Chapter 298. Zhao Leu's question didn't interrupt Jing Jiu's train of thought. On the contrary, it made him think even more seriously. What he had said to Lu Shui was the truth, and it was his heartfelt words. For this world, ascension was the greatest evil, but it was also his greatest and only pursuit. As such, good and evil were like floating clouds to him. It was only because his cultivation needed to be undisturbed, and he needed peace and quiet. Of course, it was also because of certain emotional connections that he had a standpoint. He understood Fong Jingtian's emotional need to avenge his master, and he also understood Lei Poyan's bitter pursuit of breaking through the cultivation state. His big brother's words could set off earth-shaking waves in the world, and it was also because he understood what everyone needed and pursued. The only exception was Jing Jiu himself. His big brother had never known what he liked or wanted. He only knew that he wanted to ascend, but he couldn't give it to him. It was the same as how he knew what Zhao Leu wanted, but he couldn't give it to her. Zhao Leu said, "Fong Jingtian asked Tian Jingren to kill you," which is obviously related to the Western Sea Sword School and Bulolin. "Why didn't the sect master and the sword justice deal with it?" Jingjiu said, "As I said, they are brothers, and there is no evidence." Zhao Leu asked, "Don't you think Shanghai Peak is very suspicious?" All the 9 peaks of Aoyama knew that Yuan Qijing didn't like the immortal Jingyang, and the way Shanghai Peak handled the recent events didn't seem right. Jingjiu knew that Yuan Qijing didn't like him, but he didn't have any suspicions. He explained to her, "He killed Lei Poyan." Zhao Leu said, "He might have killed him to silence him." Jingjiu looked at her in silence. After a moment of silence, Zhao Leu said, "Well, It's a good thing that Lu Shisui's cultivation problem can be solved. Even though she said so, she was still displeased after being tricked by Shilai Peak, and Jian Ryun and the others were so muddle-headed. She breathed heavily. Jing Jiu knew that she was unhappy. In fact, he was not used to it either. In the past, if he encountered such a situation, he would either kill the person with a single strike, or the other party would kneel down and beg for mercy before he drew his sword. It had never been like this, where his hands and feet were tied. What cultivators lack the least is patience. He didn't know if he was teaching her or advising himself. When Jing Jiu was trapped in a snowfield, Gu Qing once said that it was never too late for a cultivator to take revenge, but Zhao Liu was never such a person. She looked at Jing Jiu and asked earnestly, "When can you enter the broken sea state?" Jing Jiu was still in the middle state of the undefeated, 5 levels away from the broken sea state. For ordinary disciples of Aoyama, they could break through the first state in a dozen years if everything went well. Of course, it was normal for them to spend dozens of years. But Zhao Liu had endless hope for Jing Jiu. Even though his cultivation state had stagnated for more than 7 years, and he was about to become the weakest disciple of Shinma Peak. In her eyes, as long as Jing Jiu could break through the broken sea state, neither Bai Rujing nor Fong Jingtian could be his match. Hearing this question, Jing Jiu smiled but didn't say anything. Zhao Liu didn't understand what he meant, asking, "What's the matter?" She didn't notice the bitterness in Jing Jiu's smile, either because the autumn sun in the sky was too bright or because his smiling face was too good-looking. Surprisingly, there was a hint of self-mockery in his smile. These were the emotions that rarely appeared on his face. Jing Jiu had never worried about his cultivation, but now it seemed that he was overconfident because he had encountered a problem that he couldn't solve. The Queen of the Snowy Kingdom gave birth, which brought about a strange change in the snowland. He and Bai Zhao were trapped in the cold cave for 6 years. During the 6 years, in order to keep the temperature in the cave and prevent Bai Zhao from freezing to death, Jing Jiu kept burning the sword fire without a moment's pause. To keep the sword fire burning, he needed to supply Zhen Yuan constantly and ensure that Zhen Yuan wouldn't be exhausted. During the 6 years, the Zhen Yuan in his body had been running at the lowest level, barely maintaining a glimmer of vitality, like the last thin ice on the river that was about to melt completely, or like the last piece of paper in the furnace that was about to be burned out. Under such circumstances, he couldn't cultivate, nor could he have the spirit to perceive heaven and earth. He could only temper his will to be extremely tough. Unfortunately, Jing Jiu didn't need this, so the 6 years were completely wasted for him. He didn't care much about it, thinking that everything would return to normal when he returned to Aoyama. Even though he was still in the middle state of the undefeated for the first 2 years, and there was no sign of a breakthrough, he was still not in a hurry. After all, cultivation was a method of grinding. Without a certain time, the rain could only splash when it fell on the green stone. Until a few days ago, when he was thinking about the problem of Lu Shisui's cultivation, in order to do a comparative study, he performed a sword observation and self-awareness, and, at the same time, made a deduction and evolution, and unexpectedly found that, if it went on like this, it seemed that the drop of water would never be able to drip through the green stone. A rare meeting was held at the Shinma Peak, either at the cliff or in the cave. Jing Jiu didn't lie on the bamboo chair, and neither did Zhao Liu. They both sat on the warm jade bed. Seeing the two of them sitting side by side, Yuan Chu naturally thought of the words "red candle," revealing a silly smile on his face. Then he sensed that the atmosphere in the manor cave was a bit depressing, so he stopped smiling and stood by Gu Qing's side with a solemn expression. The white cat and cold cicada didn't like the warm jade bed, so they crouched on a bamboo shoot in the distance, unwilling to come closer. The reason Jing Jiu gathered the crowd was that he intended to solve his own cultivation problem. Zhao Liu thought it was ridiculous, thinking that if Jing Jiu couldn't solve his cultivation problem, who else in all of Chaotian could? Yet, Yuan Chu thought it was normal. No matter how talented his senior master was in the sword work, he couldn't be better than his master with natural Dao quality, and Big Brother Guqing had an outstanding comprehension ability. Even though Yuan Chu was on the verge of catching up with his senior master in cultivation, it was natural for his senior master to ask for help. It was admirable that his senior master didn't feel ashamed to ask for help. Guqing, of course, didn't think the same way as Jing Jiao. His master was so powerful that he could easily obtain the true Sword of the Nine Peaks. How could he be qualified to help him? Jing Jiao didn't pay attention to what his two disciples were thinking. He told them about the problem he had encountered and got to the point. It was because his flying sword couldn't merge with his sword pill. Hearing this, Guqing and Yuan Chu looked at the black iron sword in front of Jing Jiao reflexively. This iron sword, inherited from the immortal Master Mo of the Shilai Peak, was quite ordinary. After being burned by his sword fire for 6 years in the snowland, the surface of the iron sword had melted and then solidified again, layer by layer, turning into something like a shell. It looked very ugly, like a pair of burnt tongs. After entering the undefeated state, Jing Jiao still carried the iron sword on his back, which had become an anecdote in the cultivation circle. Who would have thought that he didn't do it on purpose, but had no other choice? Chapter 299. The sign of the undefeated realm was that the flying sword could be hidden in the sword pill. Since Jing Jiao was in the undefeated realm, why couldn't he do the most basic thing? Gu Han and Yuan Chu had never heard of this kind of thing, let alone come up with a solution. The air in the cave residence suddenly became quiet, and it lasted for a while. Jing Jiao came to his senses and said, "Forget what I said." Gu Han and Yuan Chu looked at each other and felt a little embarrassed. Zhao Liu came up with an idea. Let's do closed-door training. In her opinion, the reason why Martial Granduncle Jingyang could have such an amazing realm was that he often did closed-door training in Shinma Peak for more than 100 years. Unlike now, even if you're still a peerless genius, how can you be so lazy and not concentrate on your cultivation all these years? In fact, this was a misunderstanding. Whether in his previous life or this life, Jing Jiao didn't agree with the common closed-door training in the cultivation world. The reason why he rarely left Shinma Peak and said that he had been in closed-door training for more than 100 years was that he didn't want to see other people and meddle in other people's business. According to his opinion, unless the cultivation reached the most critical moment and couldn't be disturbed, then it was necessary to isolate himself from the world and concentrate on breaking the realm. Usually, cultivation was just meditation, absorbing the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, and understanding the truth of heaven and earth. Why did he have to shut himself in the cave for so long? After hearing this, Zhao Liu remembered that Jing Jiao was not an ordinary cultivator. Ordinary cultivators, including her, often needed to do closed-door training, except for the critical moment of breaking the realm. Even if it was just ordinary cultivation, if there was a more quiet, independent space without being disturbed, of course, it would be more helpful to absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth and purify the Taoist heart. Jing Jiao didn't need to do this. Everyone in Shinma Peak knew that he could cultivate even lying on the bamboo chair. Many times, there was a cat sitting on his head and a cicada sitting on the cat's back. He seemed to be able to enter the state of bright Taoist heart at any time and anywhere. Zhao Liu even had a feeling that he might be in this state all the time. This was an awesome talent. Then why is senior brother Zhuoru Zhui of Qingguang Peak in seclusion? Yuan Chu asked curiously. Zhuoru Zhui was the last disciple of the enlightened master. He was also the most talented disciple before Zhao Liu and Lu Shui. His position among the disciples of Aoyama was very high. Even though Zhao Liu had become the master of Shinma Peak all these years and Lu Shui had done so many great things, it still couldn't change this fact. The reason was simple. It was because he had been in seclusion. From the first day they entered Aoyama, many disciples knew that senior brother Zhua was cultivating in seclusion at Tianguang Peak. Many years later, senior brother Zhua was still in seclusion. Not to mention those disciples, even Zhao Liu and Jing Jiao had never seen Zhuoru Zhui. There were many cultivators who had been in seclusion for decades, or even longer, but it was rare to see a young cultivator like Zhuoruzhui, who had been in seclusion for more than 10 years when he just entered the mountain gate. Anything that could be done to the extreme would be extraordinary. As the time of seclusion grew longer, Zhuoruzhui became more mysterious and eye-catching. Jingjiu said, "In the words of the officials in the human world, he is nurturing his prestige." Gu Qing understood what he meant. He smiled and said nothing. Yuan Chu understood the meaning of nurturing his prestige, but he didn't understand what it had to do with Zhuoruzhui's seclusion. Jingjiu asked, "If the imperial court wants to recruit a famous scholar as an official, what will he do if the official position isn't what he wants?" "He will refuse, of course. That way, his reputation will be higher, and he may get more in the future," Yuan Chu said, "but I still don't understand. There are no official positions in the Aoyama sect. What is senior brother Zhuo waiting for? He is waiting for a moment when he can be sure that he is the strongest cultivator in the young generation of Aoyama." Jingjiu said, "I can even imagine those scenes. In the past 10 years, there were several times when he succeeded in breaking through the state. Just when he was feeling happy, he suddenly found out that there was a young fellow disciple in Aoyama who had broken through the state before him. He was so shocked that he could only return to the manor cave gloomily." Gu Qing and Yuan Chu naturally looked at Zhao Liu. Many records of cultivation in the Aoyama sect were recorded in Shinma Peak. It was either the immortal Jingyang or Zhao Liu. Jingjiu was referring to the latter. Zhao Liu looked at him and said, "It's a bit unkind to guess a fellow disciple without any basis." Jingjiu said, "It's not a guess. The sect master took him as his last disciple, so he must like him very much. And what a person likes most is the person who is most like them." "I don't think I'm like you in any way," Zhao Liu said. "Actually, we are quite alike," Jingjiu said. Zhao Liu was startled and said, "You seem to be talking a bit too much today. Since you want me to go into seclusion, then I'll tell you everything I want to say in the future." Jingjiu looked at her and said, "When I go into seclusion, don't delay your cultivation. Don't let him get ahead of you." Zhao Liu said impatiently, "You'd better worry about yourself." She was very respectful to Jingjiu, but she pretended to be indifferent in front of others. But she couldn't help it now. Staying behind closed doors was an important matter for the cultivation practitioners. They had never seen Jingjiu stay behind closed doors, but they had only seen him lying on the bamboo chair, so they had to be more cautious. After Zhao Liu had finished writing the sword letter to inform all the peaks, she inserted the thoughtless sword into the cliff wall, activating the forbidding formation to seal off the whole of Shinma Peak. The stone door of the manor cave was closed slowly. She said to Gu Qing and Yuan Chu, "He might stay behind closed doors for many years, so there's no need to stay here all the time. Let's disperse first and come back to check on him in a few days." A few cries of monkeys could be heard in the cliffs, but there was no sign of anyone on the peak top. The white cat strolled out from the manor cave slowly and looked at the autumn sun with narrowed eyes, showing an indescribable contented expression. The forbidding formation of Shinma Peak had been opened, so the cat could come out to bathe in the sun at any time. It was quite a pleasure, but it was a pity that he couldn't squat on Jingjiu's head anymore. A band of smoke rose up on the ground, and along with a clear sound of friction, Cold Cicada ran out and squatted gingerly by the white cat. There were many manor caves on the Shinma Peak that were unused. Jingjiu found a manor cave in the deep end of the peak and walked in. The arrangement in the manor cave was simple: a stone bed, no futon, and a clear spring water trickling down from the wall. There was nothing else. Jingjiu didn't form the Dawa seals or set up the formations like other cultivation practitioners did when they stayed behind closed doors. He walked to the stone bed and sat down casually. Jingjiu sat cross-legged, his body leaning forward slightly, his right elbow resting on his knee, and his right hand supporting his chin. He was deep in thought. He had been meditating for more than 10 days. During this process, he didn't get up once, nor did he take a sip of the spring water. His posture didn't even change. Zhao Liu and the others came to check on him twice after they were certain that Jingjiu wasn't afraid of being disturbed. They had no idea what he was doing, but they had a feeling that Jingjiu, who was in deep thought, resembled the ferrymen in the famous frescoes at the Shuanglin Temple, exuding a kind of solemn and mysterious beauty. One day, Jingjiu opened his eyes and looked at the iron sword by his side, thinking of something. The iron sword flew up and arrived in front of him. According to the cultivation methods of the Aoyama sect and other sword sects, after one entered the undefeated state, the flying sword would merge with the sword pill by thinking of something. This process was usually called withdrawing the sword. The cultivation practitioners had many ways of withdrawing the sword. Some would make the flying sword disappear, and some would swallow the flying sword. There were also some more unconventional ways of withdrawing the sword. For instance, the elders of the ancient sword sect preferred to bring the sword pill out of their bodies to receive the flying sword in the air. For a swordsman in the undefeated state, withdrawing the sword was the simplest thing to do. However, Jingjiu couldn't do it. No matter how hard he tried, the iron sword couldn't get close to his body. Chapter 300. Jingjiu had been practicing the sword all his life. It could be said that he had been sailing with the current, moving forward with an indomitable spirit. After breaking through the state of spiritual stability, which was relatively difficult and could only be achieved by time, if he could keep this up, Zhao Liu might not be able to enter the state of free travel faster than him. However, he had already foreseen the problem before he completed the state of inherited will and was ready to break through the state of undefeated. Therefore, he had hesitated for a long time when he should enter the state of undefeated. He had traveled with Zhao Liu for 3 years, but he still hadn't made up his mind. It was not until the sword trial in Aoyama, when Lu Shisui's meridians were all broken and he was expelled from the mountain gate, that he finally made up his mind, and then his speculation was confirmed. He had entered the state of undefeated successfully, but the problem was that he couldn't take the flying sword into his body and could only carry it on his back wrapped in a cloth. During the Zither tournament at the Plum meeting, many cultivation practitioners were surprised to see him carrying a sword on his back. Tong Lu even mocked him, but he didn't know that he had no choice. Jingjiu understood the reason, but he didn't expect that this problem would become a real problem if he wanted to break through the state of free travel. To enter the state of free travel from the state of undefeated, one needed more abundant sword source and a more tranquil Tao heart. Most importantly, the cultivation practitioner needed to attach his spiritual soul to the sword pill and nurture it together with the flying sword until the two minds were truly connected and the spiritual will was gradually born. This was the legendary sword ghost. The current meaning of the state of free travel meant that the sword could travel 100 miles away and the cultivation practitioner could travel around by riding the sword. But in fact, in the very beginning, the state of free travel meant that the sword ghost could leave the cultivation practitioner's body and travel around freely under the control of the sword will. The sword ghost was also called the sword devil or sword spirit in some sections. It could completely carry the spiritual soul of the cultivation practitioner and could be regarded as the second incarnation of the cultivation practitioner, just like the yuanying of the mysterious Taoist sections. The yuanying of the mysterious Taoist sects was the most secretive existence of the cultivation practitioners, and so was the sword ghost. Compared to the cultivation practitioner, the sword ghost was very weak and could be easily hurt. Of course, as the cultivation state of the cultivation practitioner improved, the sword ghost would become more powerful and harder to destroy. If the cultivation practitioner became a figure in the state of heavenly arrival, the sword ghost sword would be as sharp as a real object, almost equal to the born shapeless sword body. In addition to the cultivation state of the cultivation practitioner, the strength of the sword ghost was also closely related to the material of the flying sword. The cultivation state of the cultivation state of the sword was closely related to the material of the flying sword. Moreover, the sword ghost was the common soul of the cultivator and the flying sword. Once it was born, the cultivator and the flying sword could no longer be separated. Therefore, if a cultivation practitioner wanted to replace his original flying sword with a flying sword of a higher level, he had better do it before entering the state of free travel. When Zhao Liu broke through the state of free travel, though the thoughtless sword was not by her side, it had already recognized her as its master, and its sword wheels were everywhere on Shinma Peak. Sword to it, even under the circumstances, Zhao, that sword could still. Liu, that possible. Under. Li had sword Liu had. The sword body. More difficult to say. The sword. Under. Jing. The Jing situation was even more troublesome. He had never thought of changing the sword. The iron sword left by the immortal master Mo was not of a high state at the beginning, but he had cultivated the sword in 2 lives, so he was well aware of the principle that the sword rose with the user. Yet he couldn't put the iron sword into the sword pill, so how could he nourish it with his spiritual soul? How could he produce the sword ghost? The problem had been solved. What he needed to do now was to find a way to put the iron sword into his body. After thinking for more than 10 days, he had come up with more than 70 methods. He used the sword awareness to develop them, but all of them failed. Back when he was in the small village of the Liu family, he had spent 1 year calculating many things, but he had never considered this. It was because he had never thought that there was a problem with his cultivation, but this was the problem he had encountered. This fact made him feel embarrassed. Looking at the iron sword in front of him, he suddenly opened his mouth after a long moment of silence. Fortunately, he came back to his senses soon enough. He thought it was ridiculous, thinking that he was not a mortal who did acrobatics, so it was impossible for him to swallow the sword. After a series of failures, Jing Jiu was certain that the sword work he had cultivated in his life was different from that of the Aoyama sect and all the other sword sects in Chaotian. He had to take a completely different path. A few days later, he made up his mind. This time he didn't try to bring the iron sword back into his body and nourish it with his spiritual soul. Instead, he employed the secret method of the Bloody Demon Church to pull his spiritual soul out of his body. Under the circumstances, he had to try even if it was a method of the deviant sections. He hadn't reached the free travel state yet, so his spiritual soul should be very weak and unable to leave his body. However, his spiritual soul and sword awareness were too powerful, so his spiritual soul actually drifted out of his body. It looked like a gloomy fire without any paper, rising and falling in the air along with the wind. Looking at the flame, Jing Jiu remained silent. The fiery spiritual soul drifted slowly onto the iron sword, making a sizzling sound, like a drop of water falling into a charcoal stove. Jing Jiu summoned it without hesitation. The spiritual soul returned to his body as quickly as possible, but it was still too late. A mouthful of fresh blood spurted out from his mouth and landed on the stone wall. All the injuries suffered by the spiritual soul would affect his consciousness without any delay or weakening. They would even be magnified many times over. In an instant, he felt a pain worse than death by dismembering his body, his face turning pale. However, he didn't make a sound even though he was in such a dangerous and painful situation. The expression in his eyes was as calm as ever. He started recuperating with his eyes closed, making sure that his spiritual soul was only a bit weaker than before. A minute later, he opened his eyes and looked at the blood stains on the stone wall, feeling a bit worried. This was not the first time he had bled. He had bled when he broke Guan Nanshan's blue ocean sword during the sword trial in Aoyama. But he wasn't worried about Fong Jingtian. Back then, he chose to return to Aoyama to cultivate all over again. The most important reason was safety, in addition to the convenience. Liu Xi and Yuan Qijing were both here, so it was impossible for them to let anything happen to him. However, it seemed that even Liu Xi and Yuan Qijing couldn't solve his problem in cultivation. What should he do? In the distant Guixing Temple, Liu Shui was facing a similar problem as Jing Jiu. He didn't have any experience in Buddhist cultivation, nor did he have any knowledge about Zen Buddhism. Back then, Jing Jiu only taught him for a year. If Shuang's son hadn't taught him for a while, he probably wouldn't have been able to understand this scripture. Of course, even if he could understand the literal meaning of the scripture, he still couldn't understand its true meaning. He pondered over the scripture day and night, growing more and more anxious, and his hair was about to fall off. Xiaohe was worried that he might really turn into a monk if he continued like this. Time passed by like this. It was late winter, and the yellow temple was covered with snow. Lu Shui still hadn't made any progress. One day, he suddenly felt that the Zhen Yuan in his body was stirring up. He knew that it was about to break out, so his expression turned grave. Xiaohe said after a moment of hesitation, "How about I secretly bring a monk back?" Chapter 301. Seeing Lu Shui's reaction, Xiaohe explained hurriedly, "Don't misunderstand me. I meant to ask a monk to come back and teach you how to interpret the scriptures." Lu Shui said, "Zen master said he wanted to see how much I could comprehend on my own. I think he meant that he didn't want me to ask someone else for help." Xiaohe opened her eyes wide with an innocent expression on her face, saying, "If we do it secretly, who will know?" Lu Shui shook his head and said, "The monks in the temple have a very high cultivation state. It's not feasible." Xiaohe said seriously, "I've been pretending to be weak. In fact, I'm very powerful, and those powerful Vedanta are all in the backyard far away from us." Lu Shui still didn't accept her proposal. Knowing that she was used to being lawless, he gave up after warning her a few times. It was very cold in the middle of winter. The Zhen Yuan in Lu Shui's body was finally in conflict. He started coughing incessantly, and his face was a little pale. Xiaohe was very worried. She wanted to go into the temple to ask for help many times, but Lu Shui was hesitant and eventually stopped her. Insan came to get the dishes. Hearing the coughing coming from the room, he was a little surprised and asked Xiaohe a few questions. Xiaohe couldn't explain it clearly, so she said that Lu Shui had caught a cold. Insan found it even more strange, wondering how a cultivation practitioner could get sick, not to mention that he was a person with natural Tao quality in Aoyama. He said he wanted to go into the room to have a look. He and Lu Shui were very familiar with each other, so Xiaohe didn't want to stop him. She purposely said a few words loudly and led him into the room. Leaning against the bed, Lu Shui had already heard Xiaohe's reminder, so he knew what to say. He said that he had taken some medicine and should be fine in a few days. Insan felt it was a little strange, but his state was far from being restored, so he couldn't see the problem at a glance like Zen master. After thinking for a while, he said, "What can I help you with?" This sentence was very simple, and he said it very indifferently, but in Lu Shui's ears, it had a sense of sincerity and trustworthiness. Lu Shui was suddenly enlightened and asked, "How many years have you been in the Guochang temple?" "Many years." Insan thought to himself that if he started counting from that time, then it would be a different story. It had been more than 300 years since the former divine emperor entered the Guochang temple to become a monk. Lu Shui asked, "Have you read Buddhist scriptures?" Insan laughed and said, "A lot." If it wasn't for the fact that he couldn't free himself from the Buddhist scriptures, why would he take such a big risk to come to the Guochang temple? Lu Shui hesitated for a moment before he took out the piece of cloth from under his pillow and handed it over. He asked, "Can you help me see what this scripture means?" Insan looked at him in silence for a very long time before he took it. The moment he touched the cloth, his fingertips almost imperceptibly trembled. This scripture began with the words, "Thus I have heard," indicating that this was the true Zen scripture of the Guochang temple. Insan silently finished reading this scripture, his heart filled with endless regret. As expected, he was a person without luck, whether it was in his previous life or this life. This scripture wasn't what he was looking for, but with his vast knowledge of both ancient and modern times, he could naturally see Lu Shui's problem from scripture. It turned out that this young fellow was facing such a thorny problem. No wonder he wanted to come to the Guochang temple. "How is it?" Lu Shui's expression was a bit nervous, but then he realized that he was asking too much and thinking too much. Even if the other party had been in the Guochang temple for a long time and had read Buddhist scriptures, he was still just a servant in the kitchen. How could he understand such a profound scripture? "It's not very difficult," San replied. Lu Shui was about to thank him and send him off, but when he heard this answer, he froze. San looked at him and smiled. Do you want me to explain the scripture to you? The vegetable garden was very quiet. Today, the sun was shining brightly. The snow on the roof melted, falling on the row of cabbages closest to him, making a clattering sound. This sound could be heard clearly even through the window. Lu Shui woke up and sincerely said, Please enlighten me. San didn't stand on ceremony, sat down on a chair, and began to explain the scripture to him. The focus of the tranquil mind is to observe. To observe is to go forward. If all are learned, to attain the four truths of emptiness, this sentence cannot be understood from its original meaning. I don't know what this scripture is referring to, but the sentence no intention to tread on the ghost baby tree is the main point. San's voice was very soft, and his tone was very warm, just like the real spring wind. The words he used were very simple, but he could clearly explain the complicated principles, and he was also very good at using metaphors, just like the most experienced teachers in the private schools in the villages. Lu Shui had already memorized this Buddhist scripture by heart, and he understood most of the literal meaning, knowing that it talked about the forms of emptiness and colors. However, the scripture was too profound, and there were too many details that he couldn't confirm, so he naturally couldn't really understand the profound meaning of the Dharma hidden in it. Now that he had the answer, he immediately understood many principles. Once the principles were understood, they would emit the most moving brilliance. The more Lu Shui listened, the more absorbed he became, and he had long forgotten everything around him. Xiaoyi didn't understand these scriptures, so she was much calmer. Looking at the servant named Fu, her willowy eyebrows gradually raised, but she didn't dare to disturb him. It was unclear if he felt her vigilant gaze, but San put down the scripture in his hand and said, Let's stop here. Having said this, he turned around and left the house. He walked into the cellar and carried 2 large loads of cabbages, and then left the vegetable garden. After making sure that he had gone far, Xiaoyi returned to the house and wanted to say something to Lu Shui. Seeing him closing his eyes calmly, as if he had learned something, she couldn't say anything. That night, Lu Shui didn't cough again. When he woke up the next morning, even his complexion looked much better. San came to get the vegetables as usual, and then he walked into the house naturally and started to explain the second section of the Buddhist scripture to Lu Shui. It was unclear whether it was because he had done his homework in advance or because he was more familiar with the lecture, but he spoke better that day. Even he could understand a little bit of what he said. Even though she could only understand 10% of what he said, she still felt that she had learned something. Lu Shui listened to him attentively, and he felt intoxicated when he heard some interesting parts. This section of the scripture was no more than 40 or 50 words, so San finished it very quickly. When he was about to leave, he suddenly found that there was an extra cup of tea on the table. He smiled at Xiaoyi to thank her, and then he went out of the house to get the winter vegetables. Xiaoyi stood at the door to see him off. On the third day, San continued to come and preach. Today, tea had been prepared on the table in advance. When he finished preaching and was about to leave, he found that Xiaoyi had even taken out the winter vegetables in advance. Every day after that, San would come to the vegetable garden to preach, and he would leave after a section of the scripture. This continued until more than 10 days later. Something happened that day, so he came much later. It was already nighttime. Lu Shui and he didn't need to rely on the light to see, but they had to pretend to be mortals, so they still lit a lamp. The dim yellow light illuminated the entire room, adding a touch of warmth to the cold winter day. The Buddhist scripture was finally finished. In the end, San said to Lu Shui, After you understand it, you must forget the scripture. Only then will you understand the true meaning of the scripture. Hearing this, Lu Shui felt a buzzing sound in his spiritual ocean, and a ray of heavenly light fell, illuminating a whole new world. He closed his eyes and began to meditate. Suddenly, the oil lamp exploded into a beautiful flower. Xiaoyi stared blankly at the light and shadow that seemed to remain in the room. After a while, she came to her senses, but she found that the person was no longer there. Chapter 302. In the deep end of the backyard of the Guacheng Temple, the tranquil meditation room was covered by the winter snow. There was a small clay stove in the room, and the yams were being cooked in the pot, giving off a faint aroma. Sitting on the bed, Zen Master was reading a book by the light of the oil lamp. He held two books in his hands. One was the collection of poems by the late emperor, and the other was the menu of the half-garden. It was unclear how he could read two books with different contents at the same time, and why he needed the light to illuminate the room. Zen Master suddenly sensed something and lifted his head to look at the oil lamp. In the next moment, the oil lamp, which had been perfectly cut and was neither too short nor too long, suddenly burst out with a faint spark. Though the flower was faint, it was still beautiful and moving. A fairy scattering the flower? Zen Master had a slightly changed mood, wondering if a senior master had come out from the pagoda forest to explain the scripts to his disciples. He had a very high status in the Zen sections. Only a few monks in the 72 ancient temples in Chaotian were qualified to be his senior master, to say nothing of the Guacheng Temple. He suddenly thought of the letter written by Zhao Liu, and sensed that it should be in the direction of the vegetable garden. With a slight change of expression, he summoned Monk Du Hai to the meditation room. Besides him, Monk Du Hai, the principal justice, was the only one in the Guacheng Temple who knew the background of Lu Shui. "You go to the vegetable garden and have a look yourself," Zen Master said after some thought. "Don't disturb that little guy." As Lu Shui walked out of the room, he saw Xiao He standing in the cold wind in a thin coat, staring blankly at the pile of cabbages in the corner. "What's wrong?" he asked. Seeing him wake up, Xiao He said uneasily, "Yin Fu hasn't come to fetch the vegetables for 3 days." Lu Shui was startled slightly, asking, "How many days have I been in the trance?" 3 days, Xiao He replied. For the highly achieved monks of the Zen sects, it was normal for them to be in the trance for a long time or a short time. Lu Shui fell silent. A few days ago, all his attention was on comprehending the scriptures, so he didn't pay attention to many things. Now that he thought about it, he naturally knew that something was wrong. Even if this was the Guacheng Temple, it was impossible for the servants in the kitchen to have such profound knowledge of Buddhism. Yin Fu naturally couldn't be a real odd-job worker. So who exactly was he? When I was young, I often listened to the stories of the Buddhist scriptures with my grandmother. In those stories, there were often eminent monks who turned into old women to enlighten the lost people. Xiao He said with some uncertainty, "Could that person be an eminent monk in the temple?" Lu Shui had also read many similar Buddhist stories. He thought that if this was really the case, then Zen Master treated him too well. He was very touched. To prove this, he left the vegetable garden and went to the temple. The front yard of the Guacheng Temple often interacted with the human world, so visitors were not forbidden. Moreover, the receptionist monk knew that he was a farmer in the vegetable garden, so he did not stop him. Lu Shui passed through many halls and came to the kitchen. He found that the usually bustling place was especially deserted today. He murmured, "What's going on?" A fat monk who was sweeping the floor said, "Today is the new year." Lu Shui was slightly startled and asked, "Big monks also celebrate the new year?" The fat monk said angrily, "Of course we don't, but those kitchen helpers are celebrating the new year." The sound of firecrackers could be faintly heard in the distance outside the temple. Those tenant workers were probably drinking. Lu Shui thought that he and Xiao He had misunderstood. Yin Fu was only going back to celebrate the new year, so he asked. The fat monk was about to drive him away with a broom and said, "Go away. We don't have such a person here. Why are you playing with me?" Lu Shui thought that was true. Thinking of the eminent monks of the Guacheng Temple who had secretly taken care of him, he naturally wouldn't be angry at the fat monk's rudeness. He said with a smile, "Master, don't be angry." The fat monk said angrily, "Butcher Zhang is dead, and you still have pork to eat? But what about us? We can only eat the leftover steamed buns from last night. How can we not be sad?" Returning to the vegetable garden, Lu Shui was about to tell Xiao He that it was the new year and that they should make something delicious, but he found that she had already prepared the dishes. One was the lightest boiled vegetable leaves, without even a drop of soy sauce. There was only a small plate of fragrant and spicy fermented bean curd on the side. There was a big bowl of the greasy braised pork trotters, which should have been mixed with the best soy sauce. The sugar was also cooked well, and the color was perfect. It must be even more delicious. There was also a pot of pickled cabbage mutton and vermicelli soup, which was yellow and white. The most beautiful dish was the shredded pork tripe in chili oil, sprinkled with dozens of chopped green onions, which looked very tempting. Lu Shui liked eating green onions very much, but his favorite was tofu mixed with shallots. Cultivators preferred bland food. His young master didn't tell him this. He learned it secretly. Before living with him, Xiao He was already a meal buddy, so she naturally knew his preferences. Seeing him sit directly in front of the tofu, she wasn't disappointed. She carefully rolled up her sleeves and was about to use her hand to pick up the whole pork trotter in the bowl and eat it to her heart's content. Lu Shui signaled her to wait for a while, and then he turned around and entered the kitchen. Xiao He was a little surprised. She didn't know whether she should put down her hands or just wait. A moment later, Lu Shui walked out of the kitchen. He put 2 sets of bowls and chopsticks on the table, picked up the wine pot, and filled 2 small cups. Xiao He understood what he meant. She hurriedly helped him put the chopsticks in order and then asked if they wanted scoop rice. Lu Shui said that they should drink a few cups before eating. Xiao He agreed. She purposely made her voice sound more crisp and sweet, trying to make him feel better. Then they started to eat and drink. Lu Shui and Xiao He put food into the 2 bowls from time to time. After a few times, Xiao He finally couldn't help but ask, "I know this must be Teacher Yin, but this one," Lu Shui said. "He is Shiwang's Sunday." The atmosphere suddenly became a little gloomy. The 2 continued to eat with their heads lowered. The room was quiet for a long time. They didn't know whether Teacher Yin and Shiwang's son had eaten these dishes or not. Xiao He ate delicately. She didn't even use her hands to hold the pork trotters, but poked them slowly with the chopsticks. The atmosphere was a little gloomy, not like the new year at all. She raised her head and looked at Lu Shui, thinking about what to say to make him happy. Every new year, people would miss their loved ones. In Xiao He's view, Lu Shui should miss Jingjiu a little, so she said deliberately, "I wonder how the Shima Peak is today." Young master doesn't celebrate the new year. Lu Shui remembered clearly that when they celebrated the new year in the village, Jingjiu felt that everything was very novel. Obviously, that was the first time he had experienced this kind of thing. He seldom thought about Jingjiu, because Jingjiu must be living a good life. Similarly, he didn't worry about his parents, who had always been in good health and enjoyed a good meal. The firecrackers in the distance rang out again, and the night fell. Lu Shui thought of the highly achieved swordsman named Yin Fu and suddenly missed him, not knowing when they would meet again. In the most remote place of the Justice Hall of the Guoqing Temple, there was a meditation room called White Mountain. Yin San and the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect were sitting on futons in monk robes, listening to the firecrackers outside the temple. They looked at each other, both feeling bored. For some reason, they didn't leave the Guoqing Temple, but hid here disguised as monks of the temple. You were almost discovered teaching him the scriptures. "Immortal, why did you do this?" the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect said while looking at him. Yin San smiled but didn't explain anything. He had been a good teacher all his life. He was the most outstanding teacher in the cultivation world. He had taught 3 people in the heavenly arrival state, but they had all betrayed him. He hadn't taught anyone for many years, so he couldn't help but miss them. Once again, his reason was defeated by his sensibility, which led to the scriptures he had been preaching these days. Maybe this was the lucky chance between him and Lu Shui. It was a pity that the scripture that Lu Shui learned was about emptiness, while he wanted to learn about life and death. There was a black bronze Buddha statue in the White Mountain room, holding various magic tools in its hands, exuding a solemn and formidable aura. An ordinary person would naturally feel reverence when looking at this Buddha statue, But Een San and the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect didn't feel that way. There were no offerings in front of the Buddha statue, only 3 bowls filled with clear water. The bowls were made of some kind of skull inlaid with silver, exuding a mysterious smell. As the night deepened, the firecrackers were heard again, followed by the distant tolling of a bell. The Guoqing temple didn't celebrate the new year, but the monks rang the bell every day, announcing the arrival of the new year. Een San opened his eyes, stood up, and walked to the Buddha statue. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect followed him. The bell tolled without end. It was the sound of time. Een San said sentimentally, "Time passes so quickly." The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect said sorrowfully, "That's why we don't give up day and night." Een San said, "We must enjoy ourselves to the fullest." Having said that, he picked up the bowl of water and drank it all in one gulp. The water splashed and wet his clothes. Like wine, there were 2 sentences in the book of Choosing Heaven with similar meanings. They were said by Qiu Shanjun and Chen Changsheng. The words, "not giving up day and night," have been my QQ signature for the past few years. I've been thinking about certain things for the past 2 years, even though I know that Sang Sang was laughing at the time. Qiu Shan and Changsheng are both young, but Een San is old. Chapter 303. Time was the fairest thing. When the tenant workers of the Guochang Temple celebrated the New Year, White Town, which was far away on the edge of the snowland, also celebrated the New Year. Due to the warmer weather, more believers came to White Town to kowtow this year. It was quite lively. Sitting on the door-sill of the small temple, Guodong listened to the noises in the distance and furrowed her brows slightly. She took out a cucumber and ate it twice, feeling a bit better. The deep voice sounded behind her. "I have fruits here all year round. Why don't you eat them?" Guodong said, "It's always the same food. I'm tired of it a long time ago." Over the years, she often came to White Town to visit him and spent the new year with him several times. After a moment of silence, the broadsword saint asked, "That year, you said that everyone began to worry, including you?" Guodong didn't answer his question, but said, "Hejan said that all the nunnery disciples were female, so he didn't want to go there." The broadsword saint asked, "What are you going to do?" Guodong said, "You told me that the Guocheng Temple doesn't have a disciple experiencing the mortal world in this generation." The broadsword saint said, "Zen Master confirmed in his letter that Jingjiu has nothing to do with the temple." Guodong asked, "What do you think of Hejan?" The broadsword saint said, "I will write a letter to the temple." He would definitely do his best to settle this matter, because it represented her acknowledgement of him. Tong Lu and Su Zai went to the West Ocean one after the other. The sect master of the No Mercy sect, Pei Baifa, was hiding somewhere, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Only Hejan and Tong Yin are left in the vegetable garden of Baotong Zen Temple. It's already New Year. Hejan snapped. "Do I really have to wait until the red moss is on the market before she allows me to leave?" Sitting by the window and looking at the go board, Tong Yin thought of the conversation they had a few days ago and tried to guess the true identity of Guodong. She didn't pay any attention to his complaint. Hejan walked to his side and said, "I'm under the control of the elders. Why don't you go back to the Cloud Dream Mountain?" Tong Yin puts down the chess piece and looks at the remaining snow outside the window. Thinking of her junior sister in the mountain, she remains silent. At the highest point of the Cloud Dream Mountain, the sea of clouds outside the cliff was like a snowfield. Baizeo withdrew his gaze and stopped thinking about his experiences in the snowland. He placed the fruit plate and the wine pot on the stone table. Zhongzhou school was different from Aoyama's sect. Zhongzhou school had a closer relationship with the secular world, and there were more worldly affairs. Every year during the new year, the sect master and his wife would leave the cave to have a meal with their most beloved daughter. This was often the only chance for Baizeo to see his parents in a year. At the request of Qingrong Peak, a gap was opened in the great formation of Aoyama during the first snowfall, and the snowflakes fell on the peaks. No one disturbed them. The snow on the top of Shinma Peak never melted. Jingjiu walked out of the cave abode and was slightly startled by the sight of the snow-white mountain. The thousands of mountain birds had not disappeared, and there were no traces of people. It was very lonely. It was unclear if Zhao Liu and the others had left to deal with something, or were cultivating behind closed doors. Jing Jiu walked to the edge of the cliff. Looking at the tail that looked like a flagpole on the snowy surface, he felt a rare interest and flicked the tail in the air. Huh! The snow-white tail exploded, looking like a fluffy white straw. The white cat bounced out from the snowy ground and shrieked angrily at Jing Jiu, baring his sharp teeth, as if he was ready to pounce on Jing Jiu at any moment. A moment later, Cold Cicada crawled out from the snowy ground. Sensei was trembling in fear. The excited screams of the monkeys could be heard in the mountain. The Shima Peak became crowded. Gu Qing and Yuan Chu appeared at the window of the Taoist hall, feeling delighted when they saw the figure of Jing Jiu at the edge of the cliff. Zhao Liu arrived by riding her sword. "Have you solved it?" she asked in surprise. She thought that Jing Jiu was indeed the most outstanding genius in the cultivation circle in the last 1,000 years, and that he had solved such a difficult cultivation problem in one winter. "No," replied Jing Jiu. Zhao Liu was taken aback a bit, asking, "Why did you come out then?" "It's time," said Jing Jiu. Cultivation was not the study of knowledge, nor was it a romantic relationship. There was no such thing as being able to move metal and stone with sincerity. Many cultivation practitioners didn't understand this, or they had no choice but to comfort themselves with this. It was always difficult to admit that one's talent was limited and that he had reached the end of his path. Such cultivation practitioners would all become the dry bones in the manor caves, like those in the hermit peaks of Aoyama and those in the back mountain of Cloud Dream. As far as Jing Jiu was concerned, 100 days was the upper limit of thinking about a certain matter. If he couldn't figure it out in 100 days, it would be meaningless to spend more time thinking about it. It would be a foolish repetition. He had to find another way at the moment. Zhao Liu understood now, asking, "Shuriwa Peak or the No Mercy sect?" There were magic pills and medicines on Shuriwa Peak, as well as countless books on cultivation collected by the Aoyama sect. The No Mercy sect was also a major sword sect, so they might be able to find some relevant information. This was the principle of learning from other mountains. Jing Jiu shook his head. He was certain that his sword work in this life was different from that of the Aoyama sect and all the other sword sects in Chaotian. He had to find a completely new method, which meant he had to find a new way. Zhao Liu asked worriedly, "What should we do then?" Jing Jiu said, "I'll go ask a friend for help." Gu Qing was startled, wondering if someone was qualified to teach his master. Zhao Liu was surprised, wondering if he had a friend. If the old way didn't work, he had to find a new way. It sounded simple, but it was actually the most difficult thing in the cultivation circle. The difficulty lay in the word new. Where should Jing Jiu turn to for help? It was neither the No Mercy sect nor the Guocheng Temple. It was because the cultivation methods in the world were always the same, and the cultivation practitioners were the same. If he wanted to find a new way, he had to look to a farther place. His friend in the alien land was like heaven and earth, so he didn't need any cultivation, so he couldn't help him. The lives in the snowland were completely different from the humans, so they couldn't communicate with each other. Though the underworld was different from the human world, the essence of life was the same. Jing Jiu had already made up his mind before he came out from behind closed doors. "I'll go to Zhaoga City," he said. Zhao Liu, of course, wanted to go with him. Gu Qing and Yuan Chu offered to go with him, but Jing Jiu refused them. "You two stay on the mountain and cultivate well." Jing Jiu looked at Zhao Liu and said, "Don't let your Rujui overtake you." This was the second time he mentioned it. Zhao Liu didn't quite understand, saying, "I'm afraid it's not safe for you to go out alone." Few cultivation practitioners dared attack the disciples of Aoyama in the world. The problem was that there was someone in the inner circle of Aoyama who had tried to kill Jing Jiu many times. Jing Jiu understood what she meant, saying, "I'll bring Ada with me." The white cat was suddenly alarmed, all the long hair on his body standing on end, looking like a large dandelion. He wondered why he should go with Jing Jiu. Jing Jiu said one word to him, "Fight." The white cat's pupils shrank, but soon returned to normal, meowing softly. Jing Jiao said, "I'll give him to the one you don't like." The white cat was obviously dissatisfied with Jing Jiao's proposal, but he couldn't think of a better solution, so he turned his head away unhappily. Did he agree to leave with Jing Jiao? Zhao Leiyu and the others were startled. What did the word fight, Jing Jiao said, mean? Why did it change the attitude of the master white ghost instantly? Chapter 304. On the same night, the cold Shangda Peak suddenly had a hint of dryness. The starlight shone down to the bottom of the well, shining on the black dog. The dead dog opened his eyes and looked up at the sky. It wasn't Jing Jiao who fell down along with the starlight, but 5 pieces of wood that were scorched black and contained a tremendous power of thunder. This was the most precious treasure of Aoyama, the Thunder Soul Wood. The Aoyama sect had only 6 pieces of the Thunder Soul Wood, one of which wasn't mature yet, and was still on the top of Bihu Peak undergoing the baptism of thunder and lightning. Jing Jiao and Zhao Lei brought the 5 pieces of the Thunder Soul Wood with them when they brought White Ghost from Bihu Peak to Shinma Peak. Besides the Immortal Sect Master and Yuan Qijing, nobody knew about it, including the people of Bihu Peak. The dead dog lowered his head and sniffed the 5 pieces of the Thunder Soul Wood in front of him. After a moment of silence, he put them under his body and hid them like bones. The next morning, on the top of Shima Peak, Gu Qing asked, "That carriage is in the Guocheng Temple. Should we ask someone to bring it back?" "No need," said Jing Jiao. "It's too slow." Having said that, Jing Jiao held the cat in his bosom and sat on the iron sword. The iron sword flew diagonally toward the sky with his body on it. Looking at the disappearing figure, Zhao Leiyu had a strange feeling. She felt that Jing Jiao was a bit impatient, not as calm and composed as before. In other words, he was lazy. Gu Qing complimented, "This is what it means to leave on a sword. This is the demeanor of the immortals." Yuan Chu was taken aback and said hesitantly, "Isn't this like riding a donkey?" Looking at Zhaoga City in the distance, Jing Jiao landed on the ground. He wrapped the iron sword in a cloth and carried it on his back, walking forward with the white cat. He was already an elder of Shinma Peak, so he only needed to report his departure from Aoyama, but he was fully aware that his departure would cause a lot of discussion. He didn't ask Zhao Leiyu to conceal the fact that he hadn't broken through the state yet. Soon, they arrived at Zhaoga City. With the travel permit prepared by Zhao Leiyu, they entered the city smoothly. Snow fell from the sky and landed on the bamboo hat he wore, gradually forming a thin layer of frost. More snow fell on the streets and was trampled into mud by pedestrians. It was the middle of winter, but Zhaoga City was still crowded with tourists. The area around the White Horse Lake was already bustling. Many people came to enjoy the snow that day, making the area even more crowded. Jing Jiao's sleeve moved slightly, and the white cat poked its head out. It stared at the surroundings curiously with its black eyes. It did not like to move, and it did not want to leave Aoyama at all. It was only because it was triggered by the past that it came out. Looking at the lively scene in Aoyama, it suddenly felt that it was not a bad idea to come out for a walk. He hadn't seen Zhaoga City for many years, and it seemed much cleaner now. Jing Jiao said, "Be careful. Don't let anyone see you." The white cat thought to himself, "I'm a living creature, not a magical treasure. How boring would it be if I'm not allowed to enjoy the scenery?" Even if his identity was discovered, what could he do? Jing Jiao said, "It's not that I don't want others to know your identity. It's just that walking a cat is a strange thing to do. I don't want to be noticed by too many people." The white cat meowed once, indicating that Jing Jiao could bring that dog with him if he thought it was inconvenient. Jing Jiao walked into a medical house by the street. A begonia flower was carved on the plaque of the medical house, which was the sign of the curtain rollers. A moment later, he walked out from the medical house, asking something. Zhao Leiyu's feeling was correct. He was indeed a bit anxious. His big brother was the only person in the world who could make him feel this way. Both he and his big brother had started their cultivation all over again, and his big brother had escaped from the sword jail 1 year earlier than he had returned to Aoyama. He was certain that he could easily make up for that 1 year's time. It had something to do with his talent, but what mattered was that the two of them used different methods. Jingjiu's method originated from the Guoqing Temple in Shuiyu Nunnery. Back when he and the Zen master discussed the Tao on the top of the Shima Peak for 100 days, they discussed the golden wheel of reincarnation. For some reason, the Zen master was the one who had the most profound understanding of this method in the world. Many years ago, Jingjiu had studied this method with Lien Sanyue for a while. The ancient script of the pill pearl that he taught to Bai Zhao in the Snowland was the result of their study. After getting used to this body, Jingjiu thought this method was perfect, but unexpectedly, he encountered a problem that was hard to solve. This made him feel uneasy. Then, he recalled the method of his big brother. His big brother's method originated from the underworld, which had many drawbacks and hidden dangers. For example, it was difficult to find a body that was perfectly compatible with his spiritual soul, and even if he could find one, he couldn't solve the problem of rapid decay. Jingjiu wouldn't try this method again, but he thought of a possible solution to the problem of the sword ghost. The person he sought help from was a swordsman of the underworld. Many swordsmen of the underworld were locked up in the sword jail of Aoyama, but they were not strong enough. What he intended to learn was the control of soul fire of the underworld, the highest state. There is only one place in Chaotian that had a swordsman of such a high state. The small snowflakes kept falling down and melted as soon as they landed on the eaves, looking like the wet horns of an old dragon. Standing at the entrance of the alley, Jingjiu looked at Taichung Temple not far away. That was the place he intended to go. Looking in that direction, the white cat displayed a hostile intent, but he restrained his energy even more, as if he didn't want to disturb anybody. Jingjiu walked up the steps, pressed the green brick on the ground, and then knocked on the door. It didn't take long before the sound of footsteps was heard. The door was pushed open, revealing a young face. "Who are you?" The youth who asked the question was about 12 or 13 years old. He looked at Jingjiu curiously. Though Jingjiu was wearing a conical hat, the youth was much shorter than him and stood close to him, so his face could be seen clearly. A shocked expression showed on the youth's face. Then he thought of something and yelled excitedly, Are you my little uncle?" Jingjiu also remembered that the youth should be the son of Jing Shang and his nephew in name. Back when Jingjiu came to Zhaoga City, the little kid wanted to be held by him and cried loudly after he refused. He didn't expect the little kid to have grown up so much. If he were a regular person, he would have many sentiments about time, family, and life. However, Jingjiu didn't show any emotion. The youth was bewildered by Jingjiu's indifference. He suddenly recalled his father's advice over the years that his little uncle was not a regular person. He pulled himself together and led Jingjiu to the inside of the door. The Jing house was as quiet as before. Some trees were planted randomly in the small garden between the living room and the side courtyard. Looking to the right, one could vaguely see the begonia, which looked like a blooming flower with the accumulated snow. Jingjiu glanced around casually, but he still didn't see any servants. However, half of the courtyard wall in the northwest was pulled down, and it seemed that the courtyard was to be expanded. Jing Shang and his wife had already come out of the living room to welcome Jingjiu. The old master stood in the living room, rubbing his hands anxiously, not knowing what to do. Jingjiu asked after some thought, "Have you eaten yet?" The bowls and plates were placed on the table in the living room, but the dishes were already half-eaten. The atmosphere was a bit awkward. Jing Shang knew that Jingjiu intended to express his goodwill, though this greeting was clumsy and shouldn't be used among family members. Yet, he didn't dare treat Jingjiu as a family member. "Yes, I have." Chapter 305. After walking a few steps to the side courtyard, Jing Shang told Gu Qing what he thought was important in a low voice, like the fact that a few officials had tried to befriend him, that the emperor had summoned him once 2 years ago, that the Gu clan had sent a great deal of money to him in secret over the years, and that Gu Qing had someone send the magic pills to him every year. Jingzhou didn't comment on the previous things, saying, the money sent by the Gu family can be used, and the magic pills can be taken. It was not because of the relationship between master and disciple, but because Jing Jiu trusted Gu Qing. Jing Shang knew that Jing Jiu liked peace and quiet, so he left after walking him to the front door. Pushing open the door and entering the room, Jing Jiu saw the young son of Duke Lu, feeling a bit surprised, asking, "Where is your father?" Lu Ming said respectfully, "My father has gone out for some business. I have informed him to come back." Jing Jiu asked, "I'm a bit curious. Is there someone waiting in the public house? Waiting for the precious porcelain to be smashed by a round stone bead?" Lu Ming said honestly, "My father seldom goes to the court, spending most of his time at home. In the beginning, he received some petitions to the throne. Duke Lu was famous in Jiaoga City for his indolence in political affairs, but the emperor didn't pay any attention to him, no matter how many times he was attacked. As a result, the officials began to realize what was going on. Of course, he doesn't stay in the house all the time. There are people who listen to the sounds." Lu Ming continued. Looking at his face, Jing Jiu remembered that Duke Lu was this young many years ago, asking, "Did he tell you everything?" "Yes." Lu Ming's voice was trembling, showing that he was very nervous. He was the son of a state duke and had seen many cultivation practitioners, so he didn't care too much about them, even if they were the immortal masters of the Aoyama sect. The problem was that Jing Jiu was not a regular cultivation practitioner, but the master whom the public house had to serve, both in the past and in the future, and the source of everything. Jing Jiu asked, "What is the situation now?" He had never cared about the situation in the imperial court or the movements of the royal family, whether in the Snowland or in Aoyama. Because the emperor still had some years left in his life, with his ability, he could naturally control everything. Lu Ming knew what he wanted to know the most and said directly, "Everything is as usual. If everything was normal, then it would be abnormal." Jing Jiu knew that Jing Xian had not been sent to the Guocheng temple. He had thought that the emperor wanted to slow down the process, but now it seemed that there was more to it. Sure enough, following Deer Cry's subsequent narration, he found out that not only was Jing Xian not crippled, his reputation was also gradually rising. If Duke Lu were to narrate it personally, perhaps he would be more subtle. After all, Lu Ming was young and a little nervous, so he was very direct. Zhongzhou School's attitude is very clear, and their support is getting stronger and stronger. Jing Jiu was somewhat puzzled and asked, "Isn't Lo Huainan already dead?" Back in the old plum garden, he and Zhao Liu had already seen through the alliance between Jing Xian and Lo Huainan. The problem was that Lo Huainan had been dead for many years, so why would the Zhongzhou School continue to support Jing Xian? Lu Ming had not expected that he would not know of the relationship between the Zhongzhou School and the Great Prince. He explained, "Prince Jing Xian's mother was by Zhenrin's beloved disciple. She died in childbirth." Jing Jiu had not heard the emperor mention this matter, so there must be more to it than meets the eye. If this matter was true, then Lo Huainan was only carrying out the will of his sect. Regardless of whether he was alive or dead, it would not affect the Zhongzhou School's support for Jing Xian. The Zhongzhou School had a great influence on the imperial court, just like the Guocheng Temple had on the imperial family. With regard to the succession to the throne, the Guocheng Temple would not express any opinion, so the Zhongzhou School's attitude was particularly important. Jing Jiu suddenly asked, "What about Yamatai?" In addition to the Zhongzhou School and the Guocheng Temple, those who had an influence on this matter were the scholars. The reason the Jing imperial court could resist the monster invasion of the Snowy Kingdom and maintain its rule was because of Yamatai. Those scholars had a high status in the hearts of the army, the regular officials, and the populace. The teachers in the house didn't express their opinions, but the prince born by royal concubine, who Lu Ming said with a bitter smile, the teachers clearly expressed their opposition. There were only 2 princes in the palace. What was the difference between Yamatai opposing the prince born by royal concubine, who, and supporting Jing Xian? Jing Jiu said, "It looks like that royal concubine who is having a hard time." Lu Ming said, "But it's not that bad." "What do you mean?" Jingjiu asked. Lu Ming glanced at him and said, 5 years ago, the Zhao family suddenly came to the palace to send a New Year gift to royal concubine Hu, and they have been in contact ever since. The Zhao family was the home of Zhao Liu in Zhaoga City. This event had caused a great deal of discussion in Zhaoga City, and its influence had continued to this day. Many people thought that the royal concubine whose hatred toward Zhao Liu was hard to resolve due to the affair between Zhu Gui and Zhu Jie, and that was why Zhao Liu was assassinated. Nobody had expected the situation to become like this. Royal concubine who was given up by the Zhongzhou school, and Yamatai expressed his opposition. It was because of this event that royal concubine who didn't have a hard time facing such a great pressure. The Aoyama sect, which had never participated in the affairs of the imperial court, had suddenly expressed its attitude. No matter how powerful and influential the Zhongzhou school and Yamatai were, they still had to pay attention to the matter. Lu Ming left through the underground tunnel and asked his father to make arrangements for Jingjiu to enter the palace that night. Seeing the furnishings in the room the same as a few years ago and the go board on the table, Jingjiu felt a bit better. He took out the bamboo chair and lay down on it. The white cat crawled out from his sleeve and lay on Jingjiu's chest skillfully, and then turned his head away in disgust. Jingjiu didn't pay attention to these details, as he was thinking about what he had just learned. Zhao Liu had cooperated with royal concubine Hu when Lo Huainan was killed, and she vaguely knew that royal concubine who was the person chosen by Jingjiu. Jingjiu didn't pay attention to these matters, as someone had to do the work. It took Jingjiu a short time to figure out the matter, and he also understood what was behind the acquiescence of Lu Xi and Yuan Qijing. It was really troublesome. Jingjiu reached out his hand and rubbed the cat, thinking that he should have brought Gu Qing with him. In the dead of night, Jingjiu arrived at a place in the royal palace, and Duke Lu welcomed him in. The whole process was quite simple. Jingjiu behaved calmly, as if he were at home. The white cat hiding in Jingjiu's sleeve was a bit nervous. As the divine guardian animal of Aoyama, his cultivation state was unfathomable, but he was still a bit nervous and even uneasy in this place. Zhaoga City was protected by the Great Formation, and the formation in the royal palace was set up by the 7 major sections. Even a swordsman in the upper state of the Broken Sea wouldn't be able to withstand it for long. Duke Lu led Jingjiu to the front of the royal study, and then turned to look at the square in front of him. The light elongated his shadow. A sigh broke out in the royal study. Looking at his own shadow on the ground, Duke Lu looked sleepy with drooping eyelids, as if he hadn't heard anything. After a long while, the door of the royal study was pushed open, and Jingjiu walked out. Duke Lu opened his eyes and led Jingjiu to the outside of the royal palace, saying in a low voice, "It's not easy for the emperor to seek peace for 1,000 years." Chapter 306. Duke Lu knew that Jingjiu had a close relationship with the emperor, even more than he had imagined. Back when Jingjiu entered the palace and met the emperor stopped administering the medicine to the royal concubine who the next day and was about to depose Prince Jing Xian. This event shocked Duke Lu. Who would have thought that the Aoyama sect had such a great influence on the royal palace and had hidden it so well? However, the Zhongzhou school was the #1 sect in the world. Though it was not as powerful as the Aoyama sect in the south, its influence in Zhaoga City was much more powerful than that of the Aoyama sect. And Yamatai had shown an unyielding attitude. The emperor was the ruler of the world, and what he sought was peace for 1,000 generations. As such, he had to consider the opinions of the majority of the people, so he couldn't make a decision on his own. Duke Lu was worried that Jingjiu would have a bad opinion of the emperor because of this, so he said so on purpose. He didn't expect that Jingjiu didn't respond to him, and instead wanted to see the young prince. What did he mean by this? It was late at night, and the royal palace was very quiet. Duke Lu led Jingjiu to the outside of the royal concubine Hu's palace, and informed the people in the palace somehow. The lights were not on, and the palace was as quiet as before. A maidservant led them into the palace from the side door. Duke Liu halted in front of the Grand Hall, lowering his head to admire his own shadow. He wasn't sure if he should hear the following conversation. Since Jing Jiao didn't ask him to, it was better to listen less. The royal concubine who sat on the bed with one leg bent, her black hair draped over her shoulders like a waterfall. Her dress was full of wrinkles, and the collar of her dress wasn't fastened properly, exposing her fair skin. She had fallen asleep and had just been woken up. Her plump body seemed to emit the warmth from the bedding, so she was still a little angry. Why do people of the Aoyama sect like to talk about things in the middle of the night? Aren't you afraid of rumors? She said this while looking at Jing Jiao. She was still innocent and adorable, but she looked even more alluring with a hint of laziness. Jing Jiao looked at her in silence. He didn't say a word, as if he was looking at a painting. He seemed to be appreciating it, but at the same time, he didn't seem to be paying attention. Royal concubine who said nothing more, staring back at Jing Jiao with a calm expression in her eyes. In the past few years, she had matured a lot. Danger and pressure from the outside world, especially the harm that the offspring might suffer, was the best way for a mother to grow up quickly. Plum blossoms only bloom when wind and frost collide. Concubine Mei, who was once favored by her, had already been driven out of the palace by her. In the end, it was royal concubine who broke the silence, because she was the one who needed help. Peak Master Zhao promised to help me in the past. She looked at Jing Jiao and said seriously, "We can't just send some cured meat every year, right?" He was serious because he was anxious, and anxious because he was afraid. His Majesty had treated her well all these years, but the power behind Jing Xin was too strong. She was a fox demon who was born to be good at seducing people, but she couldn't turn those terrible cultivators into her supporters. All she could do was think about it with her pitiful intelligence, and the more she thought about it, the more desperate she felt. Shima Peak was only one of the 9 peaks of Aoyama. Though it was the inheritance of the immortal Jingyang, the people on the peak were still young, and their cultivation states and experience were not high enough. How could they withstand the pressure from the Zhongzhou school and Yamatai? What would happen to her and her son when Jing Xin became the emperor decades later? Jing Jiao didn't answer her question, saying, "I want to see that child." Royal concubine who hesitated a bit, but she asked a maidservant to carry the child out after some thought. Not long after Jing Jiao came back from the snowland, royal concubine who had been pregnant for a few years, finally gave birth to a prince. Although it sounded a little strange, there was indeed a connection between the two incidents. Looking at this child who had a close relationship with him, Jing Jiao let out a faint smile. His name is Jing Yao. For some reason, royal concubine who felt nervous, just like when she was selected to enter the palace. "It's a good name," said Jing Jiao. The word Yao meant lofty. The little Prince Jing Yao had just woken up and was still a bit groggy. He sat by the side of royal concubine who, suppressing his sleepiness while rubbing his slightly red eyes, looking quite obedient. Recalling the scene when he saw his nephew for the first time, Jing Jiao asked, "Do you want a hug?" Looking at Jing Jiao's face, the little prince nodded with his eyes wide open and then opened his arms. Jing Jiao wouldn't hug him for real, because he had never hugged anything except Lu Ada. The little prince glanced at royal concubine who, and found his mother, didn't show any reaction. He pulled back his arms and sat back down, looking aggrieved with his head lowered. Jing Jiao didn't pay attention to his reaction, asking, "What do you like?" Royal concubine who was certain that Jing Jiao was inspecting her son, feeling even more nervous, but she couldn't say anything. The little prince thought about it seriously for a while, and then said in a soft voice, "Yellow sugar cake." Royal concubine who felt a bit embarrassed. She explained that the palace maid had made some in the small kitchen during the New Year's Day, and the little kid had found out about it and ate a few pieces secretly. Just this once. "I don't usually let him eat too much sugar, because it's said that it's bad for his cultivation." Jing Jiao thought that cultivation had nothing to do with eating sugar. He said, "He has to eat it when he wants to. This is true. He can eat it secretly at such a young age. This is wisdom." If he knows, he should tell me on his own initiative, so that I won't be unhappy if I find out later. This is Jean, very similar to his father. You've taught him well. You've done a good job. Hearing this comment, royal concubine who was overjoyed. She asked the old maidservant to take the little prince back, and then waited for what Jing Jiao had to say next. As expected, Jing Jiao asked directly, "Are you willing to let him be the disciple of our Aoyama sect?" Royal concubine who had been guessing his intention and had thought about it many times. There was no reason for her to be unwilling. Jing Jiao was the youngest elder of the Aoyama sect, a famous figure in the cultivation circle and the personal disciple of the immortal Jingyang. Regardless of seniority, prestige, or inheritance, it could be said that he was perfect and flawless. Who wouldn't want such a teacher? Seeing the expression in royal concubine whose eyes, Jing Jiao knew that she had misunderstood him. "It's not me," he said. He was the master of the little prince Jing Yao, so the seniority was not correct. Royal concubine who was taken aback slightly and said awkwardly, "Isn't Peak Master Zhao a bit too cold?" In her mind, since it was not Jing Jiao, it had to be Zhao Liu, but she didn't realize that the seniority was still incorrect. Jing Jiao said, "The master I've chosen for him is Gu Qing. Gu Qing is competent, meticulous, and elegant, so he should be able to communicate with Jing Yao." Royal concubine who of course knew who Gu Qing was. The Gu clan was a large clan in the south, and they had been secretly supporting her schemes in the imperial court over the years. Most importantly, she couldn't forget the young man who didn't even take a glance at her in the Grand Hall. He had also said some very harsh words to her. If it was that man, she wouldn't like it. As royal concubine who was about to refuse, she suddenly felt that she would miss a lot of opportunities if she refused Jing Jiao's request. After a moment of silence, she said, "Okay." After returning to his manor, Jing Jiao wrote a letter back to the Aoyama sect. The letter was for Gu Qing, and Jing Jiao pointed out the purpose of the letter. Teaching the prince might affect his cultivation, but it would only take a few years, so it wasn't a big delay. Jing Jiao handed the letter to Duke Liu and said, "When Gu Qing arrives, you arrange for him to go to the royal palace and let him study with Jing Yao for 2 years." Duke Liu felt the weight of the letter was as heavy as a mountain. The news that Gu Qing had become the teacher of the young prince would spread throughout Chaotian in a short time. Was this how the Aoyama sect showed its sword directly? Duke Liu thought of what Jing Jiao had said, wondering why the emperor didn't arrange it himself if such an important matter required the consent of the emperor. Jing Jiao knew what was on his mind, saying, "I have something more important to do." "What do you need me to do?" asked Duke Liu. Jing Jiao said, "I can't do it without you." Duke Liu suddenly had a bad feeling. "I want to go to Taichung Temple." Chapter 307. It was rumored that in the distant ancient times, there existed a magic treasure, or a divine treasure, that could turn back the time. State Duke Liu had thought this was nonsense, but when he heard what Jing Jiao had said, he wished it was true, so that he could go back to what he had said a moment ago and swallow back what he had said a moment ago. He was the chief of Taichung Temple, so it was easy for him to bring Jing Jiao to Taichung Temple. However, he was well aware that Jing Jiao was not a regular person, so the Taichung Temple Jing Jiao wanted to go to was not the Taichung Temple in the eyes of the common people, but that place. To say nothing of the strict rules of the imperial court, he couldn't bear to see Jing Jiao put himself in danger because of the relationship between him and the state duke manor. Duke Liu was prepared to stop him at all costs, and he had come up with a dozen persuasive reasons in a short time. However, when he saw the calm expression in Jing Jiao's eyes, he knew that whatever he did was futile. He couldn't change Jing Jiao's decision even if he held his sword to his neck. "I don't know which level you want to go to. If it were only the first level, I might be able to do something, but it's too dangerous to go further down." Duke Liu gave up trying to persuade Jing Jiao. He wiped off the sweat on his forehead with his sleeve and said in a low voice, "You should be well aware of what Taichung Temple is. If that being were to be alerted, the emperor and I wouldn't be able to get you out of there in time, let alone me." Jing Jiao said, "I've never been there, but I've prepared for it. You don't have to worry. Besides the snowy kingdom and the heavenly well, Taichung Temple was the most dangerous place in Chaotian. In his current cultivation state, it was useless to prepare for it. Thinking of all this, Duke Lu couldn't help but sigh. Please give me a definite answer. Which level are you going to go to? He asked. I'm not sure, said Jingjiao. Upon hearing this, Duke Lu knew he was done for, but he didn't dare ask Jingjiao why he wanted to go to Taichung Temple. How long are you going to stay there? He asked in a trembling voice. Jingjiao thought for a moment and said, if it's fast, 3 years. If it's slow, I'm not sure. It would take 3 years at the fastest? Another uncertain answer? Duke Lu's head buzzed, thinking that it was really over this time. Duke Lu left the Jing mansion through the underground tunnel. His back view was somewhat dejected. Jingjiao lay down on the bamboo chair. The white cat crawled out from his sleeve and jumped onto his chest. It stared at him from above, its eyes filled with killing intent. Didn't you bring me to Zhaoga City to fight with that guy? Now that I'm ready, you want to go to that dark place? Jingjiao said, since you want to fight it, the best way is to go in with me. Hearing this, the white cat's eyes lit up, thinking that this was indeed a great idea. But in the blink of an eye, it rejected this possibility. It was said that that damned place was damp and dark. Some places were bitterly cold, and some places were unbearably hot, and there were many mosquitoes. The most troublesome part was that that place was the home ground of the opponent. Even if the white cat could catch the opponent unprepared, he would still fall into the enemy's trap. If he died there, wouldn't he become the biggest joke in the world of the divine beasts? Jingjiao received the spiritual awareness of the white cat and found it was indeed problematic after some thought. No matter how well Ada could conceal his energy, he was not as good as Jingjiao in this aspect, so he would be easily discovered by that person. Let's do it then, Jingjiao said. You keep an eye on this place for me during the years I'm away. The white cat narrowed his eyes, indicating that he didn't understand. The biggest taboo in the cultivation circle was to harm the family members or descendants of the cultivation practitioners in the mortal world, even though the cultivation practitioners had to cut off the mortal world. As long as Shima Peak existed in Aoyama, nobody dared to harm the Jing family. The problem was that if Zhongzhou School and Yamatai wanted to persuade Shima Peak to change their attitude, the Jing family in Zhaoga City would have to bear a great deal of pressure. Having heard Jing Jiao's explanation, the white cat reached out his right paw and scratched his collar, meaning to ask Jing Jiao what he could get out of it. Jing Jiao said, this is a fight. The white cat mewed discontentedly. Jing Jiao said, if Jing Yao becomes the emperor, we will win, and Zhongzhou School will lose. You have been fighting with him for thousands of years, but you still can't decide the winner. It's because neither we nor Zhongzhou School can watch you two fight to the death. So let's use this matter to determine the winner. Having heard this, the white cat fell silent for a long time. In fact, both the white cat and Jingjiao were fully aware that the white cat would lose if they fought to the death. Among the principal guards of Green Mountain, the round turtle had never left Tianguang Peak. Both he and the Dark Phoenix were a bit weaker, and the Black Dog was the only one who could fight the two guys of Cloud Dream Mountain to a draw. The white cat jumped down from Jingjiao's back and disappeared without a trace after meowing twice, his whereabouts unclear. He agreed to Jingjiao's request and promised that if something went wrong, he would keep his opponent busy so that Jingjiao would have a chance to escape. The Pure Heaven Bureau had been busy in the last few years. They were busy cleaning up the mess of the cultivation practitioners, organizing the files of the cloud platform, and sending the resources to various sects, arresting the remnants of Bulo Lin, and preventing them from committing suicide in order to find out more secrets, especially those related to the underworld. One day, a carriage covered with a black cloth was pulled into the office of the Pure Heaven Bureau. The officials of the Pure Heaven Bureau, who were used to all kinds of things, didn't feel anything unusual, but they were curious about the identity of the prisoner. It was because the carriage had the energy of a formation, indicating that the prisoner had a high cultivation state. The carriage covered with a black cloth didn't stop at the Pure Heaven Bureau. It passed through the back office and entered a narrow path, heading toward Taichung Temple not far away. The official of the Pure Heaven Bureau in charge of this area had a high status, so he understood the reason. He signed the papers and sat back at the table behind him. The official of the Pure Heaven Bureau watched the black carriage disappear into the narrow path. Thinking of the rumors about Taichung Temple, he shook his head and picked up the teacup to take a sip. In Taichung Temple, Duke Liu was also drinking tea. He put down the teacup and felt the hardness of the object in his sleeve. After a moment of hesitation, he didn't take it out. He had intended to give this magic treasure of Zhongzhou School, the slanting wind and fine rain, to Jingjiu, but he thought that Jingjiu was already prepared for it, so he didn't want to interfere. Otherwise, if that person sensed its energy, something bad might happen. It didn't take long before the carriage covered with a black cloth came out from the narrow path, heading toward the back of Taichung Temple, passing through Jingjiu's field of vision. Duke Liu didn't lift his head to take a look, his eyelids drooping slightly, his expression terrible. Chapter 308. Duke Liu had already made the necessary preparations. He reported the matter to the emperor and decided to become the most diligent official from that day on, sitting in Taichung Temple and drinking tea every day. In the meantime, he requested a position in Nanhezu for his son, Lu Ming, for 3 years. If nothing went wrong in 3 years and Jingjiu came back, Lu Ming would be able to return to Zhaoge City. Otherwise, he would go to Aoyama through his relationship with the Gu clan. Duke Liu picked up the teacup again and glanced at the outside of the room imperceptibly. The carriage with the black cloth covering it had already disappeared. Jingjiu sighed in his mind, hoping that everything would go well. The carriage with the black cloth covering it came to the deep end of Taichung Temple, passing through a patch of bamboo forest and continuing along a straight path. The straight path was paved with cobblestones, and the wheels of the carriage made a squeaking sound as they rolled on the cobblestones. The sound grew louder because the straight path had gradually slanted and turned into a gentle slope, leading to the underground. The officials here wore black official robes, on which a dragon claw was painted. They looked quite powerful, and it was obvious that they didn't belong to Taichung Temple. A few officials locked the carriage in front of a stone wall with an iron chain. The exquisite immortal figures and clouds were carved on the stone wall. It was unclear which sect the grandmasters belonged to. The light suddenly dimmed, and the surroundings became dark. The carriage sank into the ground slowly, like an animal sinking into a swamp. It was soundless, but it was frightening. The deeper they went into the ground, the colder and colder it became. It was dark everywhere, and no light could be seen. A few minutes later, the wheels of the carriage landed on the ground, making a pa sound. Sitting in the carriage, Jingjiu sensed the coldness and the endless darkness around him, calculating the position and distance in silence. If he were to escape from here in the future, he had to remember all the things that had happened today and all the details. A sound rang out outside the carriage, which should be the sound of the wheels rolling on the ground. The ground seemed to be covered with a layer of sand and pebbles, but the weight of the wheels seemed to be a bit too heavy. Along with a few faint sounds, the formation attached to the carriage was removed and the locked door was opened. Even though he was in absolute darkness, Jingjiu could still see enough with his sword eyes. 2 puppets appeared in front of the car door. Under the puppet was a flat plate formed by 8 small wheels. Its body was made of the hardest black gold, and there were extremely complicated arrays drawn on it. No wonder it was so heavy. This place was just like the sword jail in Aoyama. The aura here was dark and filthy, or perhaps even stronger. Even a righteous expert with a firm Taoist heart would be infected if he lived here. In the best-case scenario, his cultivation would be greatly damaged. In the worst-case scenario, he would be possessed by the devil. In the worst-case scenario, he might even be controlled by the dark and filthy aura. Therefore, just like the sword prison in Aoyama, there were no humans here. The dead dog was in the sword jail of Aoyama. There were puppets guarding this place. What was this place? There was a prison in Chaotian that was responsible for imprisoning the highly achieved swordsmen of the deviant sects, the devil men of the underworld, and the monsters of the Snowy Kingdom. It was the famous Fiend Prison. Everybody knew about the existence of the Fiend Prison, including the mortals and the 3-year-old children, but few people knew where the Fiend Prison was. Even in the Orthodox cultivation sects and the Imperial Court, few people knew the secret. The Fiend Prison was Taichung Temple. Its exact location was under Taichung Temple. Duke Liu had been the chief of Taichung Temple for many years. Many people thought of him as a noble person, but they didn't know that this meant that the emperor had absolute trust in him. Jingjiu was thinking of a way to leave with the 2 puppets of the mysterious gold so that he wouldn't look like a prisoner. All of a sudden, he sensed a formidable energy coming from a distant place. Such a formidable energy must have come from a powerful spiritual soul. Once it landed, it could easily crush or destroy all the non-material spiritual beings. Even though this spiritual soul was not as powerful as the one in the deep end of the snowland, it was close to the level of the spiritual soul. Jingjiu didn't look at the source of the energy, nor did he react to it. It was because he had learned his lesson in the snowland. He was merely a young disciple of Aoyama with a low cultivation state. No matter how powerful his spiritual energy was, he couldn't resist such a being head-on. As such, he couldn't let the opponent discover his existence. Jingjiu closed his eyes and guarded his Tao heart, allowing the energy to land on him. The huge waves formed in his awareness sea, spreading violently in all directions. Jingjiu became a small boat in the vast ocean, all of his awareness sinking to the bottom of the ocean. The energy soon turned into a hurricane sweeping over heaven and earth. As a result, Jingjiu became a feeble and soundless fallen leaf in the wind, all of his energy dispersing with the wind. Jingjiu was like a regular cultivation practitioner, knocked unconscious by the energy. As the energy moved further away, the being didn't pay any more attention to the place. Jingjiu knew that the opponent hadn't discovered him, and that the opponent wasn't testing him. It was because every prisoner who entered the Fiend Prison would be baptized by this energy. No matter whether he was a devil man of the underworld or a highly achieved swordsman of the deviant sects, he would be crippled after passing this ordeal. His mind would collapse, and it would take a long time for him to wake up. In this way, the Fiend Prison didn't have to worry about the prisoners escaping or committing suicide when they were first locked up. This method was very brutal and could even be called cruel. But thinking of that being who had suffered in Jiaoga City for so many years, in a sense, it was even worse than the dead dog, so Jingjiu could understand why it was so. 2 puppets of the magic gold dragged the unconscious Jingjiu out of the carriage. They flew in the darkness for a long time, until they heard many noises. Jingjiu was locked in a cell. Jingjiu opened his eyes. He didn't try to sense the surroundings of the cell, but looked at the outside world. There was no light in the dark Fiend Prison, but countless noises could be heard in the cliff-like world. There were many caves everywhere among the cliffs, and the dangerous formations were everywhere. It was unclear how many prisoners were locked up here. This was the first level of the Fiend Prison, where the prisoners were either the powerful officials, the assassins of Bulow Lin, or the elders of the deviant sections. After suffering the impact of the energy, some of them woke up slowly, but many of them were still immersed in the broken mental world. Those people talked in a language that nobody could understand and sang a song that nobody could understand. They had been talking and singing for many years. Hearing the sounds in the darkness, which sounded like tens of thousands of insects gnawing on the leaves, the prisoners with weak willpower would be scared unconscious. Standing in front of the cell door, Jingjiu listened to the noises calmly. Every prisoner in the Fiend Prison wore the source lock, and the formations were protected in the cells. Their mental energy was shattered by the energy, so they had no chance of escaping. Yet this was not a problem for Jingjiu because he had 2 keys with him, and he knew how to unlock the formations in this cell. Jingjiu took out the keys, unlocked the source lock, unlocked the formations, opened the cell door, and walked into the darkness. The fiend prison was managed by Duke Liu, so it was impossible for him to be trapped here, like the sword jail in Aoyama. His luck had always been good, both in his previous life and this life. Yet he still had to be cautious. It was because Duke Liu was not the most powerful person in the fiend prison, and neither was the emperor. Jing Jiao didn't make any sound, nor did he breathe, nor did he have a heartbeat. He was like a ghost walking in the fiend prison. It was impossible for those prisoners who had woken up and the highly sensitive puppets of the mysterious gold to discover his existence. There was a broken cliff in the deep end of the darkness, with the old black vines hanging down from the edge of the cliff. Jingzhou didn't jump down from the cliff by following the vines. If someone could see the scene in the darkness, they would see his white cloth fluttering in the wind like a flower. In fact, the rims of his cloth and his movement didn't make any sound in the wind. It turned out that it was not a flower, but a cloud. Chapter 309. The prisoners on the second level of the fiend prison were not those officials and assassins, but the truly powerful swordsmen. For example, some sect masters of evil sects or great demons of the underworld. It was even said that there were some demons left behind from ancient times. Jingzhou's feet didn't really touch the ground, or else they would have made a sound. But from the slight changes in the air beneath his shoes, he could feel that the sand and stones on the ground had become much softer, like hard candy that had been exposed to the sun for a long time. This place was in the deep part of the fiend prison, and there was no sun here, but it was still very hot, many times hotter than the ground with the sun. The second level of the fiend prison was called the eternal prison. In addition to not being able to see the sunlight all day long, it meant that one would never be able to leave, and it probably had something to do with this dreadful heat. The air was filled with the smell of fire, as if someone had sprinkled countless chili powder on it. Just one breath would cause pain in the throat. Jing Jiao did not like the coldness of Shangda Peak and the snowfield, but he was not too careless about the heat. Moreover, he was not breathing at this time, so he did not have to worry about choking and coughing. He continued walking forward. The air was getting hotter and hotter, and the darkness was getting thicker and thicker. In his eyes, he could see many ripple-like lines on the exposed stone walls. It was not weathering, but traces of being softened by the heat wave. After walking for a long time, the stuffy heat finally subsided and the temperature dropped slightly. Jingzhou stopped and reached out his hand to grab the air. Where cold and heat alternated, there would naturally be wind. He was not worried that his movements would cause the wind to disturb anyone. The next moment, he grabbed the air. He rubbed his fingertips together, feeling a little greasy, as if there was something extra in the air. After walking for a while, they could finally see something else in the air. It was a green fog with a strong, fishy smell. It should be very toxic. Jingzhou did not mind. After confirming that the white clothes he was wearing could withstand it, he felt relieved. Just as he was about to move forward, he suddenly felt his shoulder lighten. Just at the moment when the iron sword was about to fall, he grabbed the sword with a backhand grip, brought it in front of him, and raised his eyebrows slightly. The cloth wrapped around the iron sword had been seriously corroded by the green mist, and it was still corroding at a speed visible to the naked eye. Jingzhou cut off a piece of his sleeve and tied the iron sword to his back before he continued forward. The green fog was getting thicker and thicker. Occasionally, it would be blown away by the wind, revealing the mottled surface of the stone mountain. Faintly, one could even see a pinkish color, just like a rotten wall of flesh. Only the true experts of the evil path and the demons could survive in such a place. Following the green mist, they reached the deepest part of a mountain stream. The wet cliffs were covered with moss, and there was a pool in the middle. It was unknown whether it was because of the duckweed or the color of the water, but the water in the pool was extremely green, with green vapor constantly rising from its surface. That was where the green mist came from. Jing Jiao stood by the pond, waiting for the wind to blow. The duckweed moved, and then the wind blew. Huge white bones could be vaguely seen in the pool, appearing extremely strange and terrifying. The white bones should be the remains of some great demon. From a shape and size, this great demon's realm was probably not much different from that of Zen Master's mountain demon father. It was unclear why such a powerful large demon was locked up in the fiend prison, and why he could escape from the prison cell and come to this pond. The pool was 1,000 feet deep, and it was filled with the most dreadful poison in the world. That demon had trained his bones to an extreme degree, and they were as hard as the magic treasures. Though he wasn't melted, he died in the end. Since that demon had escaped to this place from somewhere else, the passage leading to the next level must be in this pool. Jingjiu furrowed his eyebrows slightly, feeling displeased, but he had no other choice. If he wanted to see that person, he had to experience something. Jingjiu walked into the green pool, making no sound, like a hot sword falling into butter. Soon, the water in the pool was over his head. The duckweed drifted back to cover the gap, as if nothing had happened. The corrosive and poisonous water in the pool was many times stronger than the green mist. As soon as Jingjiu entered the pool, the white cloth on his body was torn apart, and then it turned into threads, disappearing without a trace along with his movement. If a ray of sunlight shone down, like the well in the sword jail, it would be a beautiful scene. Jingjiu swam in the water. Soon, he arrived at the deepest part of the pool. He came to the world below after passing through a narrow crack in the rocks. This was the third level of the fiend prison. The person he was looking for should be here. Different from the first two levels, the third level of the fiend prison looked quite ordinary. Though it was dark and devoid of any light, it was neither hot nor poisonous. The air flowed naturally, like the spring breeze caressing one's face. It was like the feeling Jingjiu had in the water, giving off a comfortable feeling. There was only one passageway here, and it looked rather deep and gloomy, leading to an unknown place. Jingjiu condensed his sword awareness into a thin line and sent it into the passageway. Even with the speed of the sword awareness, it still took a long time for the line to return to his awareness sea. It was easy to imagine how long this passageway was. The passageway was filled with an unimaginable amount of chaotic wind. The deeper he went, the stronger the chaotic wind was. In the end of the passageway formed an unimaginably powerful forbidding formation. Even in his heyday, Jingjiu was unwilling to enter this passageway. There were other reasons besides the fact that it was troublesome to dismantle the forbidding formation. He was fully aware why the chaotic wind in this passageway was so strong and why the forbidding formation at the end of the passageway was so formidable. The abyss was on the other side. The abyss led directly to the underworld. Jingjiu didn't want to go to the underworld, nor did he want to step into that passageway. Where could he go at the moment? He turned around and took 2 steps to the left. An extremely wonderful feeling appeared in his sea of consciousness. He didn't know where he was. To put it more precisely, he had lost the sense of his position in the space. In the next moment, he felt that time seemed to have frozen, and he had no idea how long he had been in the fiend prison. The third level of the fiend prison was called Taichung. It was said that it was the opposite of the Zen sect's impermanence. It was of course ridiculous. Jingjiu knew that this was merely a rumor. Taichung was merely a pronunciation, not the word Chong. However, it had been mentioned so many times that people thought Taichung prison was the same word. Even Taichung Temple got its name because of this. Taichung prison was completely isolated from heaven and earth. No energy or energy of heaven and earth could enter this place, and no energy or energy could leave this place. The absolute stillness would make time lose its meaning, even more so for the space. Yet, without a sense of his position and being unable to ascertain his position, how could Jingjiu find that person? Jingjiu closed his eyes, letting himself drift in this dark and peculiar space without any direction or destination. In a world without the concept of space, any direction and destination would make one lose his way. Jingjiu drifted in the darkness. He looked relaxed, but he was actually quite serious. If he got lost here, it would be troublesome to leave this place. The reason he dared come here to find that person was because he was certain that the object he brought with him would form a mysterious connection with that person. After drifting in the darkness for a long time, Jingjiu had finally stopped. In fact, he didn't feel that he had stopped, but he opened his eyes and woke up when his Tao heart was stirred slightly. There was a patch of light and shadow in front of his eyes. The black and white colors mixed together and couldn't be separated. The moment he saw the patch of light and shadow, the patch of light and shadow suddenly changed. It broke into tens of thousands of pieces and then gathered together to form a new scene. The green forest, the red soil, the limpid lake, the blue sky, the purple flowers, and the brown birds. The heaven and earth were full of colors, but there was no black and white. A person was watering the flowering trees. The clothes on his body were even more exaggerated. It was indescribable that they were colorful, as if all the colors in the world were painted on them. Chapter 310. Sensing the arrival of Jingjiu, that person put down the wooden ladle he used to water the plants and turned around to look at Jingjiu. Jingjiu said, "In comparison to the other places of the fiend prison, this place is like the fairy realm. For us, the human world is the fairy realm, and this prison is ultimately in the human world." That person's skin was extremely pale, as if he hadn't been exposed to the sunlight all year round. For some reason, he had neither eyebrows nor eyelashes on his face. His face was extremely smooth and pale, even a bit transparent. His eyes were very big, and the pupils occupied a larger area, looking like black almonds or bottomless pits. It was quite eerie. When the wind blew over the flowers and grass, making a sound, his ears would turn along with the sound, and he could see clearly that his eyes were also very large. The most eerie part was that there seemed to be a great deal of light hidden in this person's body, which would emit from time to time through his colorful clothing and neck. These were the typical characteristics of the devil men of the underworld. That was why he had said that the human world was the fairy realm. The devil men of the underworld would disguise themselves when they appeared on the ground once in a while, but he had no need to disguise himself in the fiend prison where nobody came to investigate. Seeing Jingjiu walking toward him, he let out a faint smile on his pale face, but it was unclear what it meant. Jingjiu walked past the flowering shrubs and arrived in front of him. That person was a bit short, reaching the height of Jingjiu's shoulder, but he had an extraordinary bearing, as if he were a king. This should be the first time you have seen a human in the last 600 years, and the first time you have spoken to a human. Under such circumstances, you actually spoke the human language. Jingjiu said to that person, "Your state of mind is really outstanding. I have seldom thought highly of anyone in my life, but you are one of them." That person said, "Your cultivation state is so low, but you can find this place without being discovered by that dragon. This is truly outstanding." With their cultivation states and experiences, they didn't need to use pleasantries or compliments to test each other. So what they said was true. Jingjiu said, "Even that dragon shouldn't be able to discover what has happened here." That person said, "That's right. So you can say whatever you want to say." "I'm not here to rescue you," Jingjiu said. That person said, "You aren't a citizen of the Dark Clan. Of course, you won't save me." "How did you know?" asked Jingjiu. That person looked at Jingjiu's protruding ears and said in a self-mocking manner, "When I first saw your ears, I really thought that those useless officials had finally thought of a way. But when you came closer, I realized that you were so beautiful. I think you must be one of those demons from the foreign continent. They don't like my people." Jingjiu said, "It feels strange to hear you call yourself Yun." That person's eyes flickered, shining like a black gem. He asked why. Jingjiu said, "If you hadn't left the underworld and been captured back then, you would naturally be able to call yourself the king of the underworld. However, you didn't have the time to ascend the throne." Hearing this, the man was not angry and said, "Although I don't know the situation in the lower bound, I think the throne of the underworld is still empty today." Jingjiu said, "As far as I know, that should be the case." That person said, "Besides this emperor, who dares call himself the emperor? In this case, I'm still the king of the underworld, regardless of whether I ascend the throne or not. Jingjiu said after some thought. What your majesty said makes sense. It was true that this important figure of the underworld locked in the fiend prison was the only descendant of the former king of the underworld. In a sense, he was the current king of the underworld. However, he was captured before he could ascend the throne. Who could capture a king of the underworld? The king of the underworld suddenly said, even in the eyes of the people in the lower bound, you are extremely beautiful, both in terms of your appearance and body. But shouldn't you put on some clothes first? Jingjiu suddenly remembered that his white cloth had been completely corroded by the water in the pond. Over the next period of time, Jingjiu had been walking naked in the fiend prison and drifting in that space. If it were someone else, he might feel embarrassed, but he behaved calmly. He took out a white cloth and put it on. However, he was a bit worried because he thought that the black iron sword should have fallen into the pond, and he didn't know how much of the black iron sword would be left when he left the fiend prison a few years later. The king of the underworld said discontentedly, I don't like white clothes, but it's better than nothing. It makes me think of beggars. Looking at the cloth made of various colored cloths on his body, Jingjiu said, in the human world, only the monks and beggars would dress like you. Really? The king of the underworld was surprised. He stretched out his arms to let the wide sleeves hang down, and then he turned around. This scene reminded Jingjiu of the time when Bai Zhao turned around to let him admire him at the Jing house. Fortunately, the king of the underworld didn't ask him what he thought of him. It seemed that he was satisfied with his clothes. Who are you? Asked the king of the underworld. A disciple of Aoyama, Jingjiu, replied Jingjiu. Oh, you are a disciple of Aoyama. A hint of nostalgia showed in the king of the underworld's eyes, which were like black gems, but it soon disappeared. You must not be a regular disciple of Aoyama, since you know this emperor is here and can find this place. Who is Taiping to you? Jingjiu had thought of many things when he stayed behind closed doors in Aoyama, especially this question. As such, he answered naturally, the immortal is my master. Hearing this answer, the king of the underworld fell silent for a while before saying, That's why. That's why you can find this place. Thank you, your majesty, said Jingjiu. The king of the underworld said, I traveled together with Taiping for 20 years, hand in hand. At least we were friends at the time. You should call me uncle, but not your majesty. Yes, uncle, Jingjiu said calmly, without any change in his expression. The king of the underworld asked, What do you want from me? Jingjiu said, I want to ask uncle to teach me the control of soul fire. Hearing this, the king of the underworld's pupils shrank like a cat in the dark. Do you know that the control of soul fire is the highest secret cultivation method of the underworld? Only the king of the underworld is qualified to learn it? Jingjiu said, I know. The king of the underworld looked at him in silence and suddenly asked, Why do you want to learn the control of soul fire? Jingjiu said, My sword phantom is different from others. It can't grow with me and can only cultivate on its own. All the cultivators of the sword sects and the orthodox Xianmen relied on their own cultivation to cultivate their sword phantom in yuanying. The sword phantom in yuanying would gradually grow stronger as the cultivator's realm increased. No one had ever heard of the sect sword phantom in yuanying being able to cultivate on their own. After all, the sword phantom and yuanying were part of the cultivator. Only when the cultivator died suddenly, the sword phantom and yuanying could inherit the spirit and become the second incarnation. If the sword phantom and yuanying could cultivate on their own from the beginning, wouldn't it be the same as having a second self? Would the second self still be the same self? This kind of thing had a fundamental conflict with the law of cultivation, so it couldn't succeed. Since it couldn't succeed, there was naturally no related cultivation method. Jingjiu also couldn't think of the cultivation method of the sword phantom. When he was in seclusion, his spirit left his body and fell on the black iron sword. This scene reminded him of the soul fire of the underworld. Even the demons of the underworld couldn't make the soul fire grow on its own. Only the legendary king of the underworld's control of Soulfire could do this. The word control in the control of Soulfire was not related to the king of the underworld, but to control. After cultivating this secret method, the Soulfire could control the cultivator. If the Soulfire could do this, what about the Sword Phantom? Chapter 3:11. How could there be such a sword ghost? This is really strange. The king of the underworld said, "Call out your sword ghost, and let me have a look." Jingjiu said, "I haven't trained my sword ghost yet." The king of the underworld said to him with a seeming smile, "If you haven't trained your sword ghost, how can you know that your sword ghost is different from others and can only practice on its own?" Jingjiu said, "I won't use such a ridiculous excuse to obtain the control of Soulfire." Yet, he had no intention of telling the truth. The king of the underworld said, "If you don't tell me, I won't help you." Jingjiu said, "If your majesty is willing to help me, it won't be because of the secret I told you. It must be because of something else." Something else? Is it because of the old friendship with your master? The king of the underworld laughed out loud, the light flowing in his body, spinning even faster. Jingjiu knew that it meant anger. The laughter stopped abruptly. The king of the underworld lifted his head and stared into Jingjiu's eyes, saying, "Don't you know that it's all because of your treacherous master that I've ended up like this?" 2,000 years ago, the immortal Chunyang of the Aoyama sect joined hands with the emperor and defeated the army of the underworld in Ozawa. Since then, there have been no more wars between the two sides. Yet, the absence of wars didn't mean that the world was at peace. The conflicts between the human world and the underworld continued, especially hundreds of years ago, when the swordsmen of the underworld often came to the human world, causing a great disturbance. It was then that a peak master of Aoyama betrayed his sect and came to the underworld, winning the trust of the king of the underworld. That peak master of Aoyama didn't ask the underworld to avenge him, nor did he make any excessive demands. All he did was become a good friend of the king of the underworld when he was still young. After the death of the king of the underworld should have ascended to the throne, but he was persuaded by the peak master of Aoyama to come to the human world for the sake of eternal peace and for the swordsmen of the underworld. They had traveled together for 20 years, and the negotiation had been intermittent. As they were about to achieve something, the human race suddenly changed their attitude toward him and locked him in the fiend prison by some means. That peak master of Aoyama was naturally Taiping Jinren, who sought eternal peace. Jingjiu knew about this. Capturing the king of the underworld alive was one of the great achievements that senior brother had made back then. Compared to that, what Lu Shui had done was really nothing. Back then, it was the Cloud Dream Mountain and Yamatsai who had taken action, and it was even possible that there were existences at a higher level. The king of the underworld was locked in the fiend prison. The underworld kept it a secret, but they couldn't do anything about it. The two sides had achieved true peace. Except for the time when the underworld master entered Aoyama, no more bloody scenes had occurred. No matter how one looked at it, the human race was in the wrong in this matter, and she was nonetheless the king of the underworld, so the human race should show her the appropriate respect. As a result, Jingjiu could live such a good life in the fiend prison. This good life had to be put in quotation marks. As far as the human race was concerned, Taiping Jinren had indeed made an unimaginable contribution, but as far as the king of the underworld was concerned, it was the most terrible betrayal. The king of the underworld demanded while staring into Jingjiu's eyes, "You are the personal disciple of Taiping. Do you think I will help you?" Jingjiu said, "He didn't have the intention of capturing you back then, but the situation had changed abruptly, so he had no choice but to go with the flow." Back when his big brother was locked in the sword jail for the first time, Jingjiu and Dead Dog went to visit him and heard his big brother say so. What Jingjiu said at that moment was the truth. The flowing light in the king of the underworld's body circulated more and more rapidly, and his face grew paler. "Going with the flow is truly remarkable," he remarked. Jingjiu said, "If you knew how he had lived over the years, you might feel a bit calmer." The king of the underworld said in a mocking tone, "I think he has become the sect master of Aoyama and the true emperor of the human race, and is living a happy life, showing a regretful expression once in a while." Jing Jiao shook his head. The expression on the king of the underworld's face suddenly changed as he asked, "Has he ascended?" "No, he is like you, imprisoned in the sword jail, never seeing the sunlight all year round." Looking around at the green valley, Jing Jiao continued, "Though he has been imprisoned for 300 years less than you, he has had a worse experience than you." Upon hearing this, the king of the underworld was taken aback, as he asked, "Who could have imprisoned him for so many years?" Based on his understanding of Taiping Zhenren, he might be killed if the cultivation practitioners of the upper worlds joined hands and made preparations beforehand, then employed those formidable human magic treasures. But to capture Taiping Zhenren and imprison him for so many years was basically impossible. With his intelligence and tenacity, no matter how strict the sword jail was, he would definitely be able to find a way to escape. Jing Jiao said, "He was captured because he was betrayed, just like you." The king of the underworld was even more interested as he asked, "Who betrayed him?" "Me," Jing Jiao answered calmly. The king of the underworld looked at him, asking in confusion, "You?" Jing Jiao did not explain, remaining calm. The king of the underworld confirmed that he was not lying, and after a long moment of silence, he suddenly burst out laughing. "Taiping, oh Taiping, to think that even you would have such a day." His laughter gradually stopped. The king of the underworld looked at Jing Jiao and said, "So you think that the hatred between him and me should not fall on your head?" "That's right," Jing Jiao answered. The king of the underworld said, "But you did not betray your own master to avenge me. So while I do not hate you, I have no reason to help you. As I said, if you were willing to teach me the control of soul fire, it would not be because of what I said, but because of something else." Jing Jiao said, "I am telling you all this in the hope that you will not lose your mind because of hatred and affect our next negotiation." The king of the underworld's eyes grew colder, like a bottomless abyss. The word negotiation makes me lose my mind. Back then, he had come to the human world to negotiate because he was invited by Taiping Zhenren, which was why he ended up like this. Jing Jiao said, "Maybe you will like the conditions I offer." The king of the underworld spoke of freedom. Jing Jiao shook his head again. The king of the underworld stared into his eyes and said, "You betrayed your own master. You knew that coming to see me would only bring harm and no benefit to the human race, but you still came. This shows that you are a heartless person. As long as you can get enough benefits, you can do anything. What does it matter if you take me out?" Jing Jiao said, "Your view of me is reasonable, but everything needs to be calculated, and any benefits are not enough for me." The meaning of this sentence was very clear. His goal was too high, and the help from others was limited. The king of the underworld said, "Apart from that, I will not agree even if you offer me the one of all things." Jing Jiao said, "I can promise you that I will capture Taiping again or kill him." The king of the underworld was not surprised to hear this. Instead, he felt somewhat relieved, saying, "As expected, no one can lock him up for life." Then he said with a smile, "But what does this have to do with me?" Jing Jiao said, "Do you hope that the inheritance of the king of the underworld will end in your generation?" The king of the underworld said, "I don't understand what you mean." Chapter 312. It was that person who arranged for Wei Chenzi, an elder in the Yuanying state of the Zhongzhou school, to assassinate Zhao Liu and then be silenced. The Dace Devil in the Muddy River and Shi Wangsun's plan to draw out Lu Shisui were also arranged by that person. The underworld was behind these two events, indicating that that person still had a great influence on the underworld even today. The king of the underworld's face was too pale to show his displeasure, but his anger could be sensed from the peculiar glint in his eyes. Those audacious slaves, those useless trash, they were actually willing to be ordered around by a human. As he was about to denounce them, he suddenly thought of his own experience, falling silent. After a moment of silence, he asked, "Where does Taiping's prestige come from?" Don't those slaves know that it was he who harmed me? Jingjiao said. He entered the underworld again 300 years ago. It's not difficult for him to gain his current prestige based on his ability and the foundation he left in the underworld. If nobody stops him, nobody can stop him from entering the underworld again after he recovers his cultivation state. The king of the underworld asked while staring into his eyes, "Do you think Taiping will shake the foundation of the underworld?" Jingjiao said, "The reason the underworld hasn't produced a new king of the underworld is because you can't appoint a successor. But the more important reason is that the underworld master refused to appoint a new emperor in your name. As a result, he can't wage war against the human world anymore and can only manage to maintain the current situation. What do you think will happen if that person enters the underworld again? That person might instigate a war between the underworld and the human race, just like the war between Bulo Lin and the orthodox cultivation sections." Jingjiao still wasn't sure what that person wanted to gain from the destruction of Bulo Lin, but he was certain that that person wanted to gain something from the war between the underworld and the human world. "As long as I'm alive, the legacy of the king of the underworld will never end. As for the upcoming war, what does that have to do with a prisoner like me?" The king of the underworld said, "You are threatening me with the affairs of the human world. This is really absurd. Taiping has escaped. Shouldn't you be the most worried?" Jingjiao said, "But you'll die in the end." The verdant valley suddenly became quiet. Jingjiao continued, "When my realm is sufficient, I will enter the underworld and pass on the king of the underworld's cultivation method to your designated successor, or directly help him ascend to the position of king of the underworld." The king of the underworld's black pupils moved slightly as he said, "The king of the underworld's seal is in your hands?" "Yes," replied Jingjiao. The king of the underworld fell silent once more. During the negotiation, the humans suddenly turned hostile and attacked him together. He had sensed it beforehand, so he dodged the first attack. He was to use the seal of the king of the underworld to kill the female practitioner with the surname Bai and then flee during the chaos. All of a sudden, a powerful force struck down from the outside of the Thunder region, blasting his soul fire and almost killing him. That powerful force was unimaginably dreadful. It was comparable to the heavenly punishment that the swordsmen of the human race encountered when they ascended. He had vaguely guessed the origin of this powerful force. Feeling hopeless, his underworld wheel was disturbed a bit, and he was trapped by the pen of Yamatsai and then knocked unconscious by a horn that broke through the clouds. By the time he woke up, he was locked up in the fiend prison, and the king of the underworld seal had disappeared without a trace. Over the years, he had often calculated where the king of the underworld seal was, thinking that it was most likely to be on the Cloud Dream Mountain. Unexpectedly, it was in the hands of a disciple of Aoyama. He suddenly thought of a possibility, asking, "Did your human race give my royal seal to Taiping as a reward?" "That's right," replied Jingjiao. The king of the underworld laughed out loud, full of mockery and disdain. "It turns out that guy is even more pitiful than me," he said. "He is merely a dog who tries his best to help his master catch the biggest prey. But he can't even have a sip of the meat soup. All he has been rewarded with is a bone that he can never chew or eat. If he couldn't cultivate the control of soul fire, he couldn't use the king of the underworld seal." The king of the underworld seal was of course the most precious treasure of the three realms, but it was merely a piece of rock in the hands of Taiping Jinren, except that it looked better. Jingjiao agreed with what the king of the underworld said, because the king of the underworld seal was merely a piece of rock in his hands. It wasn't until this time that the king of the underworld finally played a role. The king of the underworld suddenly asked, "Is the king of the underworld seal in your hands?" He had asked the same question earlier, but the meaning was different. "I'm not stupid," said Jingjiao. This statement had a few different meanings. For example, he was wary of the fiend prison or the king of the underworld. All in all, he meant that the king of the underworld seal was not with him at the moment. The king of the underworld remained silent for a while, folding his hands behind his back. During this short period of time, Jingjiao did some self-reflection. It was a rare act for him to do so. He had thought about all these things when he stayed behind closed doors in Aoyama, and he had made arrangements for them. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to find the king of the underworld. He had also prepared the following conversation, from the way he addressed Jingjiu as uncle in advance. Now he suddenly found that he had been influenced by some people and had made a simple matter complicated. The negotiation didn't need to be as thorough as Gu Qing's. It was pointless to pretend to be as considerate as Zhao Liu's, or to be as talkative as Lu Shisui's, or to be as shameless as Yuan Chu's. Jingjiu was, after all, not a young disciple of Aoyama, so he couldn't imitate Jingjiu no matter how hard he tried. As such, Jingjiu decided to make the matter simpler. He didn't stop the king of the underworld, even though he knew what he was up to. The king of the underworld suddenly remarked sentimentally, "You are like your master in some aspects. Unfortunately, you are still a bit young and a bit naive." Jingjiu had already made up his mind, so he didn't bother to say anything more. The king of the underworld was a bit surprised, but he still said, "I know the king of the underworld's seal is with you." Jingjiu looked at him in silence, saying nothing. From the king of the underworld's point of view, Jingjiu's behavior was completely different from before. Jingjiu thought Jingjiu was tricking him, and a mocking smile appeared on his pale face. "I know how terrifying that dark space is. There's no definite location or direction there. Even your master and the queen of the snowy kingdom couldn't find me. So how did you do it? Naturally, it's because you're carrying something that can connect with my mind. There's only one such thing in the world, and that's the king of the underworld's seal." Jingjiu thought that it was unnecessary to say such a simple inference one more time. The king of the underworld said expressionlessly, "You actually want to deceive me. That's ridiculous." Jingjiu suddenly asked, "Is it because you haven't spoken for too long that you want to talk?" The king of the underworld asked, "What do you want to say? I know you don't want to talk, but you need to delay for a period of time to use the control of Soulfire." Jingjiu looked at him and said, "By now, those Soulfires must have entered this world through the soles of your feet and turned into a large net to trap me." The king of the underworld's black pupils constricted slightly. "Since you know, why don't you point it out or run away? You and that person are used to controlling everything, and it's impossible for me to give you what you want the most, so you'll definitely try to do something. But if I point out your plan or run away, you'll repeat the same thing until you give up all hope. It's very slow to keep trying, and time is very precious." Jingjiu said, "So let's make things simpler. You should quickly do what you want to do and prove that it's meaningless. Only then can you move on to the next step." Chapter 313. A young disciple of Aoyama, facing the king of the underworld, showed such an attitude that he would allow the king of the underworld to attack him at will. Anybody would think it absurd, not to mention the king of the underworld herself. "You've been locked up for too long." Besides this statement, Jingjiu didn't give any further explanation. Anyone who had stayed in the fiend prison for more than 600 years would have their cultivation state damaged greatly. More importantly, this seemingly green and pleasant valley was still a part of the Taichung prison. This place was isolated from heaven and earth, and there was no underworld river or underground fire, so Jingjiu couldn't cultivate here. All he could do was let the yuanqi and soul fires in his body disperse gradually in the tiniest form, vanishing in the dark space. According to Jingjiu's calculation, the king of the underworld had at most 1% of his prowess back then. However, no matter how weak the king of the underworld was, he was still the king of the underworld. A swordsman in the middle state of the undefeated had no way to defeat him. Looking at Jingjiu, the king of the underworld said emotionlessly, "But it's enough to kill an ant like you." Jingjiu's reply was still concise, consisting of only one word: "Please." The soul fires were shapeless and colorless, and it was hard to count them. Jingjiu suddenly had a feeling that countless soul fires filled heaven and earth. In the next moment, the shapeless and colorless soul fires came out from the green grass, the purple flowers, and the blue sky, as if they were painted with a layer of light color. Jingjiu's field of vision was filled with the light-colored patches. He could see them no matter where he looked. Strangely enough, These faintly colored soul fires were different from the soul fires of the underworld master he had seen. They gave off a feeling of vividness. This should be the control of soul fires that he wanted to learn. Hand over the seal of the king of the underworld, or die. The king of the underworld continued while looking at Jingjio. You know that I won't have any psychological shadow if I kill you. Aren't you worried that you will alarm that dragon? Asked Jingjio. The king of the underworld said, they promised me that this is my world. Otherwise, I would have killed myself a long time ago. Why would I allow them to threaten the underworld with me? Jingjio looked at him in silence. He didn't say anything, but his intention was clear. 600 years ago, the humans took advantage of his trust and locked you in the fiend prison. Do you still believe what they said 600 years later? You will die if you alarm that dragon. Of the underworld. Do you believe them? 600 years ago, you will. You will of would be had world and of a dragon, said of Jing underworld said. Of underworld and of dragons said. Would be you to death. Of world and eyes would. Is of your world. Would. Is his hope, said to king. King is. Of is. To always is to is. The king of the underworld said with a smile. As long as we get back the seal of the king of the underworld, do you think this fake heaven and earth can trap this emperor? Except for the few words he said to Jingjio in the beginning, Jingjio hadn't used the title emperor until now. It was because Jingjio was the real king of the underworld at this moment. The soul fires fell down from the sky. They were not as heavy as the rainstorm, but more like heavy snowfall. There seemed to be some gaps in the snowfall, but it was impossible to pass through them. Jingjio had no intention of leaving. When the human cultivation practitioners encountered the soul fires, they would either kill their owners or evade their nets. Otherwise, they would have to use the magic treasures or the chaotic swords to resist the soul fires. Jingjio chose the last method, which was also the stupidest one. He followed his will. The sword wills were entangled. The gentle wind blowing around the valley cut countless flowering trees into pieces. Boom! The whole valley seemed to have collapsed. It was merely an illusion. The green valley was still the same as before. The ground didn't shake, and the grass didn't fly up. Although the king of the underworld had said so earlier, he certainly didn't want to alarm the dragon if he could. The soul fires fell on Jingjio's body. The colors were also painted on his white clothes, and they immediately became real flames. The flames were so strong that they leaped dozens of feet high. It was as if underground lava had erupted. The soul fires had no heat. Such violent flames did not ignite a single tree. The blazing soul fires gradually engulfed Jingjio. Only a vague figure was left, swaying in the flames. The king of the underworld looked at the figure in silence, with an indifferent expression. The green valley regained its silence. The seemingly majestic flames didn't make sound. They just burned quietly. Time was unknown in the mountains. It was the same in the prison. After an unknown amount of time, the fire in the valley finally died out. The flames disappeared in the air. The soul fires became invisible and returned to the king of the underworld's body. That figure reappeared. After being burned by the soul fires for such a long time, Jingjio still didn't die. There were many small holes in his white clothes. His face was pale, and he looked extremely tired. At this moment, he looked like a seriously ill scholar who had just escaped from the fire of a ruined temple. The king of the underworld's face was even paler. He looked at Jingjio in silence. He was indeed extremely weak after being suppressed for 600 years. In his opinion, since Jingjio was Taiping's disciple, even if his realm was low, he might really be able to hold on for a while. What he didn't expect was that Jingjio actually held on until the end. He also didn't expect that his hidden methods would also be useless. The king of the underworld was very sure that his jade seal was on Jingjio. When Jingjio fought against the soul fires, he used the hand of the river Styx to search the place, but he didn't find it. He didn't even find a spatial artifact. Where was the seal of the king of the underworld hidden? The king of the underworld strengthened his life connection with the seal of the king of the underworld without hesitation. He used the hand of the river Styx to continue searching. Finally, he arrived at the space where the seal of the king of the underworld was kept. However, the hand of the river Styx still couldn't bring back the seal of the king of the underworld after such a long time. It was because that space was too large. The space in the fiend prison was already very large, but it was still far from being comparable to that space. The king of the underworld had never seen or imagined such a space. He was certain that this was not the interior of a spatial artifact. It was because heaven and earth weren't so large. Where was that space? What the hell were you? Looking at Jingjiu, the king of the underworld had many conjectures. The light flowing in his body had gradually subsided. "Why is it so large?" he asked in a hoarse voice. Jingjiu said in a hoarse voice, "Heaven and earth should be so large." The king of the underworld fell silent, deep in thought. Jingjiu had already figured out what Jingjiu had done, asking, "Do you still want to try?" The king of the underworld said, "There is one thing I don't understand. No matter how abundant your sword source is, it's impossible for you to maintain it for such a long time." Jingjiu said, "If it were a bit longer, I don't know if I could maintain it." This seemingly simple contest was in fact the most dangerous situation he had encountered since his rebirth. His consumption during this period was no less than what he had consumed during the 6 years in the Snowland. What he consumed was not the sword source, but his mental energy. He was confident in his body, so he brought the sword force back into his body, protecting the Tao tree and the sword pill. The destructive power of the soul fire was similar to that of the mental energy, but it could also cause substantial damage. As such, it was not the same as when he confronted Tian Jingren in the old nunnery in the Plum Garden. His body was baptized by the soul fire. The pain was directed to the deepest parts of his body. If it were anyone else, staying in the soul fire of the king of the underworld for such a long time, even if they didn't die, they would certainly go mad. But he was Jingjiu. But he would still be in pain. He would be injured. The king of the underworld was silent for a while, then asked, "Then why are you not afraid?" Jingjiu looked at the blue sky and said, "As long as I can leave this place alive, it's worth the risk." His answer was very similar to what the king of the underworld had said. Chapter 314. If one lost everything, one would have nothing to lose. If one had nothing to lose, one would naturally be fearless. The king of the underworld stared at Jingjiu in silence. Her dark eyes that were as deep as the abyss were glimmering, representing the subtle changes in her emotions. Sympathy or respect? The king of the underworld asked, "You said that you want to enter the underworld to help me rebuild my heritage. Not to mention that it is extremely difficult. Even if you succeed in doing so, the situation will change many years later, and the upper world may not be able to suppress my clan anymore. Aren't you worried that my successor will become a scourge for the human race?" Jingjiu said, "The underworld has never been or should not be a scourge for the human race, just like how the human race has never been a scourge for the realm of immortals." The king of the underworld said, "Taiping said the same thing to me back then." Jingjiu said, "These principles did come from him because I rarely think about these things. But I think what he said makes sense, at least on this point." The people of the underworld, especially those powerful demons, wanted to pass through the abyss or climb out of the heavenly well to come to the human world. It was because the human world had sunlight and spiritual energy, an environment more suitable for life, and a real sky. Just like the human cultivators who wanted to ascend, all living beings yearned for a wider world, higher and further. There was nothing wrong with this. Just like the deviant sects who wanted to possess a spiritual source, this was also not wrong. It was just that the human race happened to be here. However, that spiritual source had already been obtained by Aoyama. For the human race and Aoyama's sect, it was naturally wrong for them to come and take what belonged to them. It was just a different standpoint. It all depended on which side they were on. Jingjiu could only consider these things from the standpoint of the human race. Back in Zhaoga City, he had once discussed this with Zhao Liu. The cultivators were not ordinary people, but the relationship between them was not like that between humans and sheep. Since they were of the same origin, they were naturally of the same race. The king of the underworld said, I have no other questions. If you can help me with one thing, I will teach you. After confirming that it would be difficult to kill Jingjiao, and even if he was killed, they would not be able to find the seal of the king of the underworld. Their hopes could be reduced to expectations, and they could return to the initial negotiations. The king of the underworld's words meant that she had agreed to Jingjiao's conditions. She just needed a way out, so this matter should not be difficult. It was not difficult, but it was absurd. Jingjiao, who wouldn't even blink when everything was destroyed in front of him, was stunned for a long time. Don't look at me like that, the king of the underworld sternly said. If you had lived here for 600 years like me, you would know how annoying it is to have a swarm of mosquitoes around you every day. Jingjiao said seriously, if there are mosquitoes, we should kill them. If we kill them, there won't be any more mosquitoes. That was a load of crap. It had been said a long time ago that nonsense was often the truth. The reason why the king of the underworld couldn't solve this problem was that this topic was beyond the scope of the truth. The mosquitoes in the fiend prison couldn't be killed. Jingjiao didn't understand what she meant. The king of the underworld stated the conjecture she had come up with after thinking about it for 600 years. The Taichung prison was isolated from heaven and earth, and it had no concept of time and space. The mosquitoes were a part of the Taichung prison, so they wouldn't change. As long as they didn't change, they wouldn't die. Hearing this conjecture, Jingjiao fell silent for a long time. He still thought this matter was too absurd and unreal. Even though those mosquitoes were a part of the Taichung prison, they should have turned back into regular mosquitoes after they entered the small world of the king of the underworld. In the words of the Zen sects of the Guochang Temple, this was the cause and effect. Those mosquitoes fly by your ears all day long, buzzing. It's really annoying, but they can't be killed. This emperor is worried sick. The king of the underworld's face was pale, and it seemed that he was truly afraid of the mosquitoes. Jingjiao suddenly remembered one thing. He was to bring Ada to the fiend prison with him, but Ada refused. The last reason given by Ada was that there were too many mosquitoes in the fiend prison. Jingjiao didn't pay much attention to it at the time, but now he thought it was indeed a problem. The environment in the fiend prison was so harsh, but why were there so many mosquitoes? No matter how many mosquitoes there were, a divine animal like Ada wouldn't be afraid of them. It seemed that the mosquitoes in the fiend prison were indeed troublesome. Yet, Jingjiao still didn't understand it, thinking that the king of the underworld could shut off his own perception even if he couldn't sense them due to his high cultivation state. Seeing his expression, the king of the underworld guessed what Jingjiao was thinking, saying, even if you can't sense them, they are still there. Jingjiao had discussed the Tao with the Zen master for 100 days, so he understood what Jingjiao meant easily. I can teach you the true concept of tranquility, he said. I don't want it. The king of the underworld said without hesitation, your master took me to visit the Guocheng temple. I can accept the concept of white bone, but it's meaningless to live without the concept of tranquility. Jingjiao thought that there was a meaning to live, but it wasn't the concept of tranquility. At the moment, Jingjiao didn't want to discuss the Tao with her. Where are the mosquitoes? He asked. Jingjiao had been in the fiend prison for more than 10 days. He had spent most of his time in this patch of green valley, save for the time he spent drifting in the dark space. Why didn't he encounter those mosquitoes that could make the king of the underworld change expression? I've used the soul fire to drive them away many times while you and I were talking. Those mosquitoes didn't go to your side. Well, the king of the underworld showed a baffled expression, asking, why didn't those mosquitoes come to bother you? Is it because your blood is stinky? Jingjiao didn't heed him, saying, now that you can use the soul fire to drive away the mosquitoes, why do you have to worry? The king of the underworld exclaimed angrily, do you mean I have to do this every day of my life? Jingjiao thought it would be too miserable and suggested, you can make a mosquito net or build a house. It's useless, said the king of the underworld. I can't block them. Jingjiao didn't understand, saying, let me see. The king of the underworld walked to the front of Jingjiao. Jingjiao heard the buzzing sound, but he didn't see anything. He looked around with beaming eyes and finally saw those mosquitoes. Those mosquitoes were really small, and even though he used his sword vision, he could only see very small black dots. He raised his hand to wave at those mosquitoes, but he didn't touch anything. These mosquitoes were really not simple to be able to avoid his wave. The size of these mosquitoes exceeded the common sense of the natural world and even exceeded the upper limit of imagination. No matter how sharp the sword will was, no matter how majestic the power, they were like a grain of dust, or even smaller than a grain of dust. How could he hit them and crush them? No wonder even the king of the underworld couldn't kill these mosquitoes. The king of the underworld glanced at his right hand. Since you're so lazy and unwilling to use the soul fire as a shield, I can only use the hardest and densest material to make a shield. Jingjiao said, Your Majesty could try to melt the mountain rocks and then bury yourself inside. The mountain rocks melted by the soul fire would leave only the purest crystals, which would solidify and become extremely dense without any gaps. Even if those mosquitoes were small, it would still be very difficult for them to pass through the solidified lava. If this method worked, wouldn't I just use the unsolidified lava to cover my body? We've done this since we were kids. The king of the underworld said angrily. Jingjiao thought he had become his nephew when he was a kid and couldn't communicate with him. It was a bit annoying, but he thought it had nothing to do with him. Those were the mosquitoes of the fiend prison, not the monkeys of Aoyama. Jingjiao said, You should let the person who imprisoned you deal with this problem. As I said earlier, nobody can come here except for you. The king of the underworld said to Jingjiao in a mocking tone, You should be well aware that even that dragon can't come here. Except for Jingjiao, nobody could come here, not even the wind and rain. The seal of the king of the underworld was the only one. The ocean couldn't enter a drop of water. Jingjiao didn't agree with this statement. If the ocean had a consciousness, it could let its consciousness enter every drop of water and communicate with the tiny life in it. Yet could that consciousness be regarded as the ocean itself? Jingjiao didn't want to think about this further, asking, You have lived with them for more than 600 years. Have you found out what they are afraid of? The king of the underworld said, I haven't found out yet, but I heard from your master that they are afraid of thunder. The verdant valley suddenly became quiet. Jingjiao looked at Jingjiao in silence for a long time before he asked, Did he tell you that there's the thunder soul wood in Aoyama? Chapter 3:15. Jingjiao said, If I brought the thunder soul wood with me, it would be a good idea to use it to make 2 deck chairs. The king of the underworld was aware that Jingjiao had already guessed his idea. It would be more than a good idea, he said after a sigh. Jingjiao said, Your idea is indeed a good one. What Jingjiao referred to was not the method of repelling the mosquitoes, but the method that the king of the underworld had thought of to get out of the prison. After that person obtained the Thunder Soul wood, he employed the method of changing souls of the underworld and borrowed the identity of a devil man of the underworld to escape from the sword jail. The king of the underworld had a deeper understanding of the method of changing souls. If he obtained the Thunder Soul wood, he might be able to escape from the sword jail by borrowing the identity of those prisoners on the 2nd level. When Jingjiao locked that person in the sword jail, the king of the underworld was already in the fiend prison, so he didn't know the method that person had employed. The fact that the king of the underworld could come up with such a method in such a short time indicated that his intelligence was not inferior to that person's. Jingjiao asked, How could a smart and calm person like you be deceived by him to come to the surface? The king of the underworld replied, sentimentally, It's because he is good at deceiving people, and I indeed want to come up and have a look. No cultivation practitioner didn't want to ascend, and no member of the underworld didn't want to come to the human world, though there was a great difference in the degree of difficulty between the two. The regular swordsmen of the underworld could come to the surface to bathe in the sun, but the king of the underworld said nonchalantly, I can't come up, and I won't be able to come up after I become the emperor. so I wanted to come up and have a look before I became the emperor. Jingjiu understood what he meant. The emperor couldn't go to the snowland, and the king of the underworld couldn't come to the human world either. The subject would try to persuade the emperor with their lives, or they would let him die first, in case he was captured by the enemy and used to humiliate and threaten them. No matter how important the emperor was, he was not as important as the whole state. Jingjiu asked, "You should be well aware of the danger of this trip, but why were you captured in the end?" The king of the underworld replied, "Because I didn't lose to schemes, but to strength." After saying this, the king of the underworld fell silent and stopped talking about what had happened in the past. Jingjiu was also silent for a while, then said, "Do you still want to chase away mosquitoes?" The king of the underworld said, "Of course." Jingjiu taught him the wind and rain Dao art. The wind and rain Dao art was the ultimate art of Ozawa. Aoyama sect had a good relationship with Ozawa and had some contact with them. Although it was not the highest tier Dao art, it was enough. What kind of person was the king of the underworld? Although his cultivation system was different from the human race, this kind of low-level Dao technique was naturally not a problem for him. It didn't take long for him to learn the wind and rain Dao technique. For a moment, the verdant valley was covered with dark clouds and a strong wind blew, as if a storm was about to arrive. Sensing the aura of the wind and rain, the mosquitoes around the king of the underworld seemed a little uncomfortable and gradually dispersed. However, they didn't go far and still stayed several feet away. Looking at the dark clouds in the sky, the king of the underworld frowned and said, "Its power is too weak and too tiring to maintain. How is it different from me, using soul fire to chase away mosquitoes?" Jingjiu said, "You can inscribe the Dao art into the formation diagram." The king of the underworld understood what he meant. He shook his head and said, "This place is isolated from heaven and earth. If the formation diagram is to be operated for a long time, its power will definitely be extremely weak." Jingjiu said, "It's fine as long as there's wind and rain." The king of the underworld didn't say anything else and inscribed the Dao art into the formation diagram. The moment the formation diagram operated, the dark clouds in the sky began to shrink rapidly, and the wind also became much weaker. The rain that had just fallen became extremely sparse. After a while, the formation diagram stabilized, and the dark clouds and rain became very small. Silence hung above the heads of Jingjiu and the king of the underworld. It was only several feet in radius. The mosquitoes had already adapted to the change in the environment. Moreover, the dark clouds and rain were really too small, so they all flew over. The king of the underworld didn't say anything. He looked at Jingjiu and waited for the next arrangement. He was sure that this disciple of Aoyama had a meticulous mind and would definitely have a backup plan. Jingjiu took out a bell from his tattered sleeve and was a little hesitant. The quality is not bad. Even the king of the underworld praised it. This bell was naturally not ordinary. It was a gift from Sensei to Jingjiu. If Sensei knew that Jingjiu had used the bell that she had carefully selected for this kind of thing, she would definitely be very angry. In that case, it would be much more troublesome for her to ask Jingjiu to do something like this. Jingjiu was hesitant because he thought of this. What if she asked him to kill all the elders of the Platonist sect in the future? However, it was something to be dealt with in the future. She probably wouldn't know that he had left this bell in the fiend prison. The bell left Jingjiu's palm and flew into the dark clouds. Those mosquitoes had already flown back to the side of the king of the underworld, making a low, buzzing sound. Strangely enough, they didn't descend to suck her blood. A crisp sound rang out in the dark clouds. It was indeed the clean heart bell of the highest state of the Platonist sect. The sound of the bell echoed in the valley, making the grass look taller and the flower petals look more tender. Jingjiu and the king of the underworld both felt their minds become clearer. The most peculiar change was at the source of the sound. The patch of dark clouds started to move along with the sound of the bell, and a flash of lightning appeared in it. The lightning was very small, as thick as a finger and as long as a chopstick. The small lightning was too close to the ground, so it couldn't make the rumbling thunder. All it made was a cracking sound. It sounded like someone's chopstick was broken, and it wasn't a hardwood chopstick but a bamboo one. The cloud was like a canopy. The lightning was like a chopstick. The sound at the dining table. Everything was so lovely, like the small bell that could be seen intermittently in the cloud. Although it was lovely, it didn't have much destructive power, but it was enough to drive away the mosquitoes. The king of the underworld didn't lie about this, at least. Those mosquitoes were indeed afraid of the thunder. They flew away and hid in the cracks between the rocks and the grass in the valley, not daring to come out again. Jingjiu looked at the king of the underworld. The king of the underworld revealed a faint smile on her face. It seemed that she was satisfied with the result. Then she stopped smiling and started her lecture without any warning. The soul fire isn't self-generated. It's found when we go to the underworld river to train and find our own soul fire, like how the disciples of Aoyama find their swords. Bringing the soul fire into the body is also a part of the training of the underworld river. We call it the soul fire. The king of the underworld continued. The next step is the most important one, which is how to bring the soul fire into the blood and form the soul fire. The passage between Chaotian and the underworld had always existed, so contact was inevitable. There hadn't been any major war in the last 2,000 years, and the hatred between the two sides had gradually subsided. The accidental and inevitable contact had gradually increased. The origin of the soul fire and the method of cultivation were no longer a secret of the underworld, especially for someone like Jingjiu. Yet, Jingjiu listened attentively and didn't interrupt or urge her to explain. The king of the underworld said, "Since you don't intend to cultivate the soul fire, it's meaningless for you to talk about it casually. Please tell me in detail," said Jingjiu. Back then, his big brother had told him about the cultivation methods of the underworld, but it was still not as good as the explanation given by the king of the underworld in person. It was a rare opportunity. Now that the king of the underworld had agreed to teach him, she didn't think it was troublesome. She told him about the soul fire states and the cultivation methods in detail. Jingjiu listened attentively. Of all the things in the world, he was only concerned about one thing. Therefore, although he looked lazy, he was actually very serious about cultivation. The crisp bell rang out once in a while, echoing in the green valley along with the voice of the king of the underworld. The grass was greener, the purple flowers were more purple, and the breeze was softer. It was a beautiful spring day. Chapter 3:16. There were 9 states of soul fire in the underworld. Besides the first state of seeking fire, the second state of possessing fire, the third state of melting fire, and the fourth state of flaming fire, as mentioned by the king of the underworld. The fifth state was an important stage, similar to the undefeated state of the Aoyama sword sect, because the soul fire could be used in combat. From the fifth state onward, the word fire was placed at the end. The fifth state was fire leaving. The sixth state was fire gems. The seventh state was fire traveling. The eighth state was fire hidden. The ninth state was fire awakening. The control of soul fire is not within the 9 states, but it's not above the 9 states either. It's not the 10th state, because it's a completely different cultivation method. The king of the underworld continued while looking at Jingjiu. After the 6th state, you have to choose whether to follow the traditional soul fire cultivation method or the control of soul fire. Jingjiu said, "The traditional method is similar to ours." The king of the underworld said, "Yes, and it's simpler. But the control of soul fire is quite troublesome. You have to endure a great deal of pain and risk. You have to cut off a part of your spiritual soul that remembers the secret cultivation method and use the fire gems to imprint it into the soul fire that has left your body, letting it cultivate and grow on its own." Listening to these words, one could sense the hidden risk and courage. Jingjiu suddenly thought of the Dace Devil in the Muddy River. Most of the demons who had wreaked havoc in Chaotian were driven by the underworld and came to the ground through the huge whirlpool or other paths in the abyss. The devil pill of the Dace Devil was imprinted with the secret method of the Bloody Demon Church. It should be a method similar to the control of soul fire, but of a much lower level. In the underworld, the control of soul fire is the most confidential method, and it's strictly forbidden for anyone except the king of the underworld to have access to it. It's because this method of cultivation could bring about unimaginable disasters. The soul fire has a real spiritual soul attached to it, and it may develop its own intelligence after cultivating on its own. In the end, it will be completely cut off from a main soul and become a new life, the devil fire. The king of the underworld glanced at him and said, "It's like that sword of yours." Jingjiu listened attentively without any change. The king of the underworld continued, "If the method of soul fire control is leaked, I'm afraid that tens of thousands of demon fires will appear and wreak havoc in the lower realm. At that time, I'm afraid that our race will be wiped out." Jingjiu asked, "Has such a thing happened before?" The king of the underworld said, "Fortunately, it has never happened, but no one dares not to take the risk. Therefore, the technique has always been in the hands of the king of the underworld." Jingjiu said, "Don't worry. I won't tell anyone except your appointed successor." The king of the underworld looked at him in silence. After a long time, he still didn't say anything. She couldn't help but laugh. "For such an important matter, are you going to make me believe you with just one sentence? Otherwise." The king of the underworld sighed and said, "Swear a blood oath." Jingjiu said, "The blood oath can be broken. As long as one's state was high enough, any shackles or restrictions on the spirit could be ignored. The so-called easily solved depended on the sharpness of the sword." The king of the underworld thought for a while and said, "Then let's begin." Just like that, it began. The king of the underworld began to talk about the method of soul fire control. Jingjiu listened in silence. After listening to all the contents of the method, he closed his eyes and meditated to digest what he had heard. Half a day later, he opened his eyes and woke up. He had a comprehensive understanding of soul fire control. There were two most difficult parts to cultivating this method. The first was cutting the spirit. This was too difficult and required another secret method to cultivate. Even if it was successful, the process would be extremely painful, far more painful than burning the body with soul fire. The second difficulty was that after the soul fire left the body, it would gradually develop its intelligence through self-cultivation. Then, how to control it to connect with a host soul at all times. This process was arduous and long. It was like an ordinary person walking slowly on a steel cable that was dozens of miles long in the air, thousands of feet above the ground. But Jingjiu didn't need to consider these two problems because they didn't exist for him. Again, whether it was in his previous life or this one, he had good luck. But what he wanted to cultivate was not soul fire, but sword ghost. The two were similar, but they were different. Jingjiu wanted to use the soul fire control as a reference to create a self-cultivation method for sword ghost. Naturally, he had to make many attempts, adjust according to the results, and finally find a path that belonged to him. The premise of using as a reference was a real understanding. And there were many parts of the underworld's cultivation methods that were completely unfamiliar to him. The king of the underworld was right in front of him, so he naturally wouldn't be polite. When he encountered something he didn't understand or was uncertain about, he would ask questions. Since the king of the underworld had promised him, he wouldn't hide anything from him. He answered all the questions one by one. As the questions and answers went on, the king of the underworld gradually became convinced that Jingjiu's idea was feasible. He grew excited even though he was shocked. Creating a new method was an irresistible temptation for any swordsman, let alone Jingjiu. He had been locked up in the fiend prison for more than 600 years. The most unbearable thing for him was not loneliness, but having nothing to do. The king of the underworld answered the questions more earnestly and cautiously. In the end, he even began to give Jingjiu his own suggestions on what to do. Hearing his suggestions, Jingjiu thought they were quite insightful, so he presented more of his own ideas to the king of the underworld. The king of the underworld gave his own suggestions after listening to them carefully. Jingjiu thought some of his suggestions were correct, but some were inappropriate. He shook his head, saying nothing. The king of the underworld analyzed his own ideas carefully, and Jingjiu pointed out the loopholes in his ideas. The king of the underworld made some minor adjustments to his original ideas after a moment of silence. Jingjiu gave his own ideas after thinking for a while. The discussion continued. As the discussion went on, the two of them spoke less and less. They spent most of the time thinking in silence. Sometimes, Jingjiu would look at the king of the underworld on the opposite side, pondering something. He spent most of his time cultivating in Aoyama, seldom sparring with other cultivation practitioners. However, he had sat opposite the Zen master on the top of Shinma Peak and discussed the Tao for 100 days. He had also watched the spring silkworm for 10 nights with Lien Sanwei. As for the discussions he had with his big brother when he was young, they were mostly one-sided. Judging from what he had seen today, the king of the underworld was not inferior to the three of them. In some aspects, he was even better than them. Sometimes, the king of the underworld would look at Jingjiu on the opposite side with a cold expression in his eyes. This disciple of Aoyama was still very young. But why did he have such profound knowledge and wisdom? He seemed to have surpassed Tai Pingzhen back in the day. Was this the principle of the pupil surpassing the master? If the human world was full of such figures, then what hope did the underworld have? The clouds that looked like cotton candy hung over the sky. The light rain was like the water droplets brought up by the willow branches from the river. The bells in the dark clouds would ring once in a while, producing a lovely flash of lightning. Jingjiu and the king of the underworld sat below in silence. Yet, there seemed to be two figures engaged in a heated debate in the dark clouds. They brought out flashes of lightning in the history of the cultivation world. Spring was actually not a suitable time for studying and cultivation, except for a weirdo like Jingjiu. It was because the spring sunlight was bright and beautiful, and it was very easy to sleep. Sleepiness in spring was something that many people couldn't resist. Sitting in Taichung Temple, Duke Liu was so sleepy that he almost dropped the teacup in his hand a few times. Suddenly, an official came to report that the chief steward of the public house had arrived and that something urgent had happened in the public house. "What's the matter?" Duke Liu asked with his eyes still closed. The official was a bit hesitant, but he still reported, "The chief steward said, the bowl is broken." Chapter 317. The warm season had passed, and spring was in full swing. It was just the right time to rest. During these days, not to mention the imperial court's yamen, official and private libraries, even the theater's business was much worse. For some reason, State Duke Liu, who was known for his laziness in governing, suddenly became diligent. Though he didn't do anything serious and merely drank tea while sitting in the chair, he hadn't asked for sick leave for dozens of days, which surprised his colleagues in the imperial court and his subordinates at Taichung Temple. Seeing his figure walking out of the yamen under the spring sun, the officials of Taichung Temple felt that everything had returned to normal. Duke Liu waved his hand to dismiss the officials who were seeing him off. He glanced at Jing Shang, who was standing inconspicuously outside the crowd, and thought for a while. He did not ask him to come forward and speak. After getting into the car, he took out a crystal from the drawer and held it in his hand. He used the spiritual energy to restore his spirit and calm his mind at the same time. He then asked, "Are you sure it's broken?" The steward of the public house was outside the car, so he was not the person he was asking about. Duke Liu was asking about a blind man sitting in the car. The blind man had white hair and was dressed in plain clothes. He was old but very energetic. The old man was Duke Liu's bodyguard when he was serving in the north. After he was injured, he was taken into the public house by the Duke and accepted this boring but important job. I heard it clearly. It was the blue and white porcelain cup that was broken. Duke Liu would not allow anyone to stay in that room for a long time. He had to be prepared at all times, so this blind old soldier was the best candidate. In the public house, this old soldier was responsible for raising birds on the surface. He lived very close to the inner court, so no one knew that his real task was actually to listen to bowls. Duke Lu came to the Jing house through the tunnel. He looked up and saw Gu Qing, who was covered in dust. As a sword cultivator, he gave off a feeling of being covered in dust. It was easy to imagine that he came in a hurry. However, Duke Lu was not satisfied and said, "How many days has it been?" It was obvious that he thought Gu Qing came too late. Gu Qing was also helpless. He was not a second-generation teacher like Zhao Liu and Jing Jiu. If he wanted to leave Aoyama, he had to submit an application and get approval. Though Aoyama didn't investigate this matter strictly, and Jing Jiu could leave secretly like Duan Liantian on Shangda Peak and Jian Russian on Liangwang Peak, his destination was Zhaoga City. Jing Jiu mentioned in the letter that he might stay in the royal palace on this trip, so it was impossible to hide it from others. No matter how isolated Shima Peak was, it still had to go through this process. Otherwise, it would be too disrespectful to the other peaks. Unexpectedly, the masters of the peaks, who usually didn't care about this kind of thing, took it very seriously this time. Whether they agreed to let Gu Qing go to Zhaoga City or not caused a heated argument. It wasn't until one night that Zhao Liu came out from her manor cave behind closed doors and heard the matter that she asked Yuan Chu to go to Zhaoga City. Gu Qing didn't get the permission until the next day. As a result, time was delayed a lot. By the time Jing Jiu arrived in Zhaoga City, it had already been raining a few times. Gu Qing explained the reason and asked Duke Lu about the real purpose of his trip. Jing Jiu had mentioned it vaguely in the letter. Jing Jiu had guessed it, but he wasn't sure. Hearing Duke Lu's words, Gu Qing thought for a while and asked, "Can I enter the royal palace at night?" Jing Jiu could sense Duke Lu's anxiety and urgency. The spring sun had already set. The begonia trees in the courtyard were shedding their petals, making them look like countless flames under the twilight. Duke Lu said after some thought, "You should have a good rest first. You don't have to wait until tonight." Jing Jiu was indeed anxious. It was because the dispute between the Aoyama sect indicated that the Aoyama sect didn't have the same opinion about what the Shinma Peak intended to do. If the Aoyama sect chose to stay out of it, how would the arrangement of Jing Jiu be carried out? As for what Jing Jiu was doing in the fiend prison at the moment, and whether he had encountered any danger, Duke Lu didn't even dare think about it. The second day after Jing Jiu entered the fiend prison, Duke Lu had ascertained that Jing Jiu had escaped from the cell. Where was he now? The starlight shone in through the window. Gu Qing sat cross-legged on the ground, cultivating with his eyes closed. But he was worried about his master's safety and thought about what would happen after he entered the royal palace the next day. So his Dao heart couldn't stay calm. He stood up and walked to the table. He looked at the famous chess game, but found he couldn't understand it no matter how hard he tried. All he could do was walk to the window and look at the night sky. The meowing of a cat could be heard from somewhere in the night sky. The meowing of the cat was neither shrill nor unpleasant, so it shouldn't be the cat in heat. A white cat appeared on the windowsill like a ghost. Feeling startled, Gu Qing bowed hastily. "Greetings, Master White Ghost." Ada didn't leave with his master. This was beyond his expectation, and it made Jing Jiu even more worried. The white cat lifted his head and glanced at Jing Jiu arrogantly, indicating that there was no need for Jing Jiu to be afraid since he was here. Of course, he didn't know that Gu Qing didn't know what Jing Jiu was going to do. It was because he thought that Jing Jiu had brought him along on this trip that he felt uneasy. Gu Qing saw the white cat off with his eyes. Having lived with him on the Shima Peak for a long time, Jing Jiu didn't fear this cat as much as he did at the beginning, but he still had to show the necessary courtesy. The white cat disappeared in the backyard of the Jing house. As Jing Jiu was about to turn around, he saw the nephew of his master sneaking to the foot of the courtyard wall, feeling puzzled. The name of the boy was Jing Li. Perhaps Jing Jiu didn't know it himself, but Gu Qing did. It was because Jing Jiu had to take care of all the affairs of his master, including his relatives in the mortal world. Jing Jiu followed Jing Jiu after some thought. As he arrived at the backyard of the Jing house and saw the scene in front of him, Jing Jiu felt startled. Jing Li was looking for something in the garden, yelling in a low voice, "Mimi, Mimi, where are you?" A white cat walked out from the haystack slowly, looking at Jing Jiu with a disgusted expression. This white cat was none other than that white cat. Seeing the cat, Jingjiu was so happy that he almost jumped up, exclaiming, "I thought you had left." The white cat meowed once perfunctorily, indicating that he wouldn't leave for the time being. Jingjiu approached him and stroked the white cat's head gingerly, saying, "Let's play." Upon hearing this, the white cat's eyes beamed. He reached out his right paw and pulled out a pair of dominoes from the haystack, pushing them to Jingjiu. He suddenly thought of something and turned to look at a shadowy spot in the backyard, his eyes as sharp as a sword. Guqin came back to his senses after the initial shock. He looked at the sky hastily to indicate that he hadn't seen anything, and then left noiselessly after calming himself down. In the early morning the next day, Guqin followed Duke Lu to the royal palace. Jingjiu's intention was quite clear. They had no need to conceal it from others, and they even appeared before the court meeting on purpose. The figures of Duke Lu and Guqin were seen by all the princes and chancellors. The news that the immortal masters of Aoyama had entered the royal palace had spread throughout Zhaoga City. Later, there was another piece of news, that a mortal master would become the teacher of the second prince. The identity and background of Guqin had been ascertained soon after. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.